ask for reporters, any other reporters in the room?
First item on the agenda is a request for determination of applicability by Jack Borges of 73 Shore Road for above-ground pool. The applicant has withdrawn their request.
They have withdrawn.
Next on the agenda is,
Go back, just take a motion to accept the withdrawal.
okay.
I make a motion to accept the withdrawal.
Second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, second on the agenda is a notice of intent, Virginia Gentile of 10 Wenzel Road, addition and deck. Right here.
The applicant and her representative are here, however, they're still waiting for the wetland scientist who has not arrived.
Okay. Yeah, we'll jump to the minutes and then come back to that. All right, so let's review the minutes from August 12th. I think on line 106, you had a question about angle points, but I think it was bounds at the angle points
Gotcha.
instead of and, just make it at. I think that's the only thing I actually had.
Yeah, and
Easy enough.
everything else. There we go.
Kathy, on line 93, was that you that made that comment?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I think so. Is the wetland higher than the groundwater? It was, right, on that site?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
That was, okay. So that's okay.
Okay. Any other changes to?
I make a
Alright.
motion that we accept the minutes as amended.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
600, sorry, 5.
5-0. All right, we'll go back to the NOI. Do they have a number, DEP number?
A DEP file number was issued, I don't have it handy, though.
Good job on the minutes, Meg.
Thank you.
Those were a lot of minutes.
There were.
Very
I'll look on the DEP website for the file number.
All right, well, yeah, I was just curious. You guys all set? Ready for you? And
Good evening, Tom Bull from Powder Consulting, here to.
We are on TV tonight.
Okay,
Tom,
perfect,
so-
so we gotta be over, perfect. So here to discuss, the changes we made.
Miles, it's a little feedy up here. Thank you. Sorry, Tom.
No problem. The changes to the plans that were requested, for 10 Wenzel Road, just a brief overview of the project involved in addition to a single-family residence, and the addition of a deck to the back of the property. We'll also be making a small cut, and compensatory storage within BLSF, along with some additional clearing within the 25-foot no disturb, which we intend to, or actually 25-foot no disturb and vernal pool buffer zone, which we intend to compensate for through the conversion of existing lawn into wetland restoration and buffer zone restoration area. In addition to that, we also filed for a stormwater permit. Copies for everybody. And the stormwater all of the comments that came up at the following hearing regarding this. And I think that's really all we have to present. Yeah, we have our cubic feet of BLS fill and compensatory storage shown on the plan. We also show the mitigation plan on the revised plan set, and also lists the amount of buffer zone to be disturbed, and I think that ticks off most of the requests of the commission.
If the commission would like, use the meeting minutes from the last meeting to kind of reference if all those things have been addressed. I looked at it and it looked like all those things were added to the plans, but just double check.
Anybody have any comments or concerns? What? Let the record show that Gene showed up at 7:10.
7:10.
And now we'll take over.
Got an extra set of plans up there, Tom?
We can share.
Yeah, actually,
Okay.
Is that right here?
So this was
This
the
is 10 Wenzel.
notice of
Yep.
intent.
The DEP file number for 10 Wenzel is 95-0933.
Oh, okay, this was the clearing.
So here are the wetland bounds.
The
We have
bounds.
the designation of how much mitigation area compared with the.
Do you want this is what we said that they
Yeah, okay. So required in the minutes.
Oh, and, okay, that's
Planting
the
plan.
mitigation area, planting
Yep.
plan, okay. Bounds are in. Okay, that's good enough, I guess. Okay, it looks like you got the 4 items that we requested.
I believe so, yes.
Comments from anybody? Any other questions?
You know, we have to act on the variance for the,
Yep,
On the waiver, correct.
right?
right.
And then
Will
on the
that be-
stormwater permit.
That'll be done
Yeah.
today or be done next time?
Why should we wait?
We also have the
I don't
stormwater
know.
permit too, right, at the same time, or to get,
Well, that's what this is.
Yeah.
plus the waiver, right?
Yeah.
Correct. I'm just asking, it's two things.
So this is the stormwater application, right?
I believe that's the narrative in the stormwater management application.
Yeah.
Find it.
Yeah, and the application page should be part of that
Okay,
packet.
Yep.
And just noting that the applicant, Virginia Gentile, came by with a signed copy. In order to get everything into you by that Wednesday following the hearing, we had to
So you gotta
get
sign.
creative and dropping it off. So there is a signed copy which was submitted
Okay,
to
yep,
Megan.
I got it. Okay, why don't we take this one item at a time. We've already got an open hearing for the NOI, for which there's a waiver request. The waiver is asking for a waiver for work within 25 feet of the no disturbs, of the wetland, which is our no disturb zone.
And the variance of the vernal pool, that's right.
Yes.
Don't touch that, yeah.
And that's represents basically clearing for 540 square feet. The rest of the 25-foot no disturb zone is already a lawn, is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, some of the backyard is a lawn,
Yeah.
which, I mean,
And this is
which is
all-
wetland,
Yes.
which is already actually jurisdictionally a wetland. So your offer for mitigation will be to replant the portion of the lawn that is now being maintained with trees and shrubs to allow it to restore to be, and the 25-foot.
It would be a portion of that 25-foot.
In a portion of the
Yeah.
25-foot, right. And that will be basically restored to a natural state.
Yep.
I'm actually wrong. You've got a note here, it's 540 square feet of clearing within buffer zone. Is that the entire buffer zone, or is that?
Yes, that's the entire buffer zone.
Okay, what of that is the 25-foot? Do you know?
My narrative here, one sec, sorry.
Because that's really the,
What's this here?
yeah, that's outside. That's the offset for the 890 square feet of buffer and wetland mitigation. Do you hear that called out? Which it is?
No, they have.
That's for clearing in the buffer.
Buffer zone.
I'm assuming that's this
Thing,
whole thing.
Yes. So it's just this section right in here.
Specifically off the top of my head,
What's the length of it? Do you have a scale? You have a scale?
Wasn't that the cubic feet in this,
No,
no? The square feet?
that's the little hatched areas.
Okay. Oh, you're talking the down. Oh.
So we don't list specifically for the clearing within the 25, but I mean, our buffer zone,
Total is
Rest are-
540.
yeah, for total clearing, and just the restored buffer zone, is gonna total,
Oh, I see, here, you've got 890 in the wetland and 630 in the buffer zone.
yeah,
Okay, so that's broken out. It's just this impact here isn't broken out.
I did not
For
list
this little-
specifically what was it within the 25, but that said, we're, restoring 630 square feet of buffer zone, which will fall within the 25, of the restored level.
And that's,
And
just looking at it, it's clearly, what you're restoring is larger than what you're proposing to clear.
And was some of that clearing because of Oriental bittersweet or other plants as well?
And that's right,
540 is, very heavily,
Invasives, yep. Okay. So the threshold for a waiver is that what they're proposing to do is a net benefit to the resource area? Does anybody have any questions relative to that issue with what they're proposing?
I think we spoke to that issue last hearing, that there's always concern. of work in the 25-foot no disturb zone.
Right.
But to your point, if it can be shown that they leave it in a better place than it was, which I believe that is the case here, that we could approve it.
Okay, any other comments from anybody? No?
And that there are no other alternatives. It's a very small space.
Right. Does anybody in the public have any comments or questions on this issue relative to a waiver for this project? No, okay. Okay, seeing that and hearing your comments, is there a motion to grant a waiver?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, 0. Okay, then moving on to the project in general, under the notice of intent. Do I hear a motion to, do I hear any other comments, first of all? No. Do I hear any comments from the public on the notice of intent to add an addition to an existing house? No.
I have a comment. There's a whole lot going on here in a very small space, and I think it needs to be appropriately monitored to make sure that all of this stuff actually happens. Other than that, I don't have any comment.
Okay, so that you're suggesting a condition in the order?
That it be closely monitored
Yeah.
by Megan.
Okay. With that, I guess I will entertain a motion to close the hearing.
So moved.
Do I hear a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So that hearing's closed, and we'll proceed to the application for a stormwater permit. Okay, so we have a valid application. It's been signed and a narrative associated with it. It is a single-family house. Okay, should note in the other, there is a little bit of impact to bordering land subject to flooding. There is also compensatory storage provided to offset that. What's your total footprint of impact?
Square footage
Yeah.
is 73 feet of fill, and then our compensatory storage will be spread over 83 square feet.
Well, I meant for the project in total.
24 by 24.
I mean, what's, our stormwater threshold is like 10,000 square feet, right? Is this the
Yeah, I
one
think
because it's
any
a site?
BLSF the way I read it is any BLSF, work within BLSF
Oh, okay.
would require a stormwater permit, which is what
Correct.
triggered it.
Okay, and then this isn't a site plan review or anything, right?
No,
No.
no, no.
Okay, okay. Okay, so it's a relatively minor amount of BLSF that's being impacted and is being compensated. It's all within lawn, right? Both
Yes,
impact and compensatory area?
yeah, we should end up with 5 cubic feet of extra storage.
Every little bit helps.
Yeah.
All right, anybody got any comments?
So what kind of wetland seed mix are you gonna be using? Is this gonna be the New England?
Probably either New England wetland mix or Ernst Seeds does a comparable one that we've found works very well in the last few replication areas I've done. So that's what we'll be looking at using.
Okay, and what time of year will you be putting that
It
down?
would be this fall. So
This fall, and
yeah.
will you be mulching it with some straw?
Yep, we just a light straw mulching.
Okay.
Now, the mitigation, the impact and mitigation area, this is just gonna be seeded with a lawn seed mix, I assume?
Yeah, it would just be.
Because that's gonna remain lawn, right?
Yep, yeah, it would just be returned to existing condition.
Gene?
Hmm.
This, as we've seen, this is a house that possibly could not have been built where it is today because of its location to the wetland, as are a lot of the other houses in that neighborhood. And I don't know this for a fact, but I believe that that wetland complex is part of the extended headwaters of Lake Washacum, which was before us a couple of weeks back, and we talked
Right.
about the importance of addressing the headwaters to address the eutrophication in Lake Washacum. So there should be something, I believe, in the order that addresses some kind of mitigation as far as if there's lawn being planted there, what goes on the lawn that doesn't make any kind of contamination in that wetlands any worse than it already is. Obviously, it's going to be a small amount on this house compared to the size of the headwaters altogether, but if we're actually going to take a stand on that, that was maybe a good place to start.
Sure.
No, I agree. We do have conditions in our
Already.
order now that addresses use of fertilizer and things like that for this very reason. Whether or not we need to make that even stronger, I don't know, given the,
Well, we could make them at least more specific.
Yeah.
So that when people read them, they understand why they're there.
that's a good point, yeah. Okay. We can do that, add some language to the conditions when we get to that. Any other questions or comments from anybody? Are there any comments or questions from the public on this issue? This is relative to the same property, this is for a stormwater permit. Nope, okay. Okay, given what Carl is just mentioned, do I hear a motion to close the hearing?
So moved.
Do I have a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay. We have this on the agenda to talk about at the end, is that correct?
No.
No.
No, not this one. I'll be drafting it between now and the next meeting,
Oh,
which will be
okay.
September 9th.
Okay,
By the
all
way,
right, good.
everybody's here at the next meeting except for Jean? Okay.
Yep. All right, that's good, because I think we need to think about the language in that one, in that condition.
Sure.
We can probably specify the, numbers for the
Did you already do this one?
nitrogen. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so the hearing's closed. We'll be voting on it at the next meeting, when we have a draft order. You're welcome to come
Okay.
for that.
That's
Um,
September 9th.
Oh, yep, that'll work.
What's going to be in the conditions?
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
good luck.
you.
It's a waiver.
That was, we just did that.
I thought this was a waiver.
It was one and the same. They were together.
Um,
Yeah, they were together.
here. Hmm?
Two separate.
No, it was, I think, all together.
Is that the one that has the direction drilling? Okay, I think that's the one. Oh, no,
You
no,
take
no,
it.
sorry, this is all.
Yeah.
Check that.
Yeah.
There's kind of a sinkhole there. I'm not sure if it was-
All right.
But it's in a way If you can too, Bill, it'd be great.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is 95-926, notice of intent and stormwater management permit for Eversource Hopkinton to Ashland transfer line, gas line replacement from Hardwick Road to Cedar Street. This was continued from August 12th. I have a conflict with this project, so I have to recuse myself, as does
I will recuse
Bill
myself
Moulton.
too.
And I'll hand the chairmanship of the meeting over to Kathy. It's all yours.
Thank you. The 95-926 Eversource Hopkinton to Ashland Transfer Line Gas Line Replacement hearing is now open. Wanted to ask Eversource if they had any opening comments that they wanted to make. What we're basically going to probably do is have the commissioners here ask any questions that they have on the response to the comments that you had made, but I didn't know if you guys had any opening comments that you wanted to make.
And we're being joined by Matt Farrell,
Thank you.
our
And
peer
that's what I
review
was saying.
engineer.
Our peer reviewer, Matt Verrill, is joining us for any clarification help that we might need on the way. Thanks. Thanks, Ed.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Rick Paquette. I'm here tonight on behalf of Eversource Energy. I'll just introduce the Eversource team to you real quick. I think you know most of them, but we've got Sean Berthume, the project engineer with Eversource, Matt Waldrop, the environmental project manager with Eversource, Melissa Hancock, community relations for the project, and we also have Ken Stanley, who's the president of Trimont Engineering, responsible for the drawings that were prepared, the permit plans. So I would offer up to provide a summary of what we filed with the commission. I don't know how much time
Brief.
you want me to spend talking before you ask your questions, but I can give a high-level overview of the information
That
that we
would be good.
submitted, if that's acceptable to you. Okay. So, as you're aware, we prepared a response package, if you will, to a number of comments that we received, comments from Megan, the agent, as well as comments from Matt Verrill at Lucas Environmental, and another engineer that subcontracted to Lucas for the stormwater review as well. So we consolidated the responses to those three batches of comments into one document to submit back to the commission to basically try to answer those questions. So with that as the backdrop, the submission was made about a week ago, August 19th. And what I'll do is just basically kind of highlight the information that we provided. So from my standpoint, I look at it as there's kind of like four areas of information that are in there. The comments kind of jump around, obviously, because they come from different letters, but the way I organize it in my head is we have resource area updates or investigations, updates to the permit drawings to address comments, additional details on construction, and then just what I kind of more of a miscellaneous is other requested data that was asked for as far as the questions that were asked of us. So with that, I just want to move through each one of those areas of interest and explain kind of what you've got in front of you. So from the standpoint of the resource area updates, we had peer review conducted with Matt Verrill. We made a number of adjustments in the field to wetland boundaries to address comments from Matt. Those boundary adjustments have been incorporated into the project plans, as well as we put together a set of figures to make it easier to understand where those boundary adjustments were made. There's a series of aerial photo GIS maps in the packet as well. Based on those adjustments, we also updated the impact calculations to the resource areas as well. And then that includes not only the resource areas, but the buffer zone and the no disturbance zone areas. And then also related to resource areas for the project, in response to a comment, we conducted a invasive species survey on the easement, collected data to document the presence of invasives within wetlands and buffer zones along the project route. And then again, that information has been provided as well. So that information has also been updated onto the construction permit plans, which I'm going to talk about now. So we provided a full-size set of revised drawings that incorporate those boundary adjustments, buffer zones. We also made some changes to call out, for example, the 25-foot no disturbance zone, make it consistent with the buffer zone. We've added information on off-site potential vernal pools to address the buffer zone area and where that intersects with the project easement as well. We responded to comments related to showing existing catch basins within the view area of the project plans and identifying those, as well as showing silt sack details for inlet protection, which was another comment related to that. Also, we received a comment related to the detail or level of detail for stream crossings. So we mobilized and had a site-specific survey done at each of the stream crossings to provide, I think it's 1 inch to 2 foot scale, so a much more detailed cross-sectional view of the individual stream crossings within the easement. And we also added notes to the plans to show the additional BMPs, erosion control measures in areas of steeper slopes. So that's kind of a high-level summary of the changes that have been made to the drawings. The next area that we addressed relates to the construction of the project and providing details on that. So in addition to the permit plans, we developed some additional graphics to help try to visualize the construction layout better, which shows the equipment that would be used, the placement in relationship to the easement, the placement of mats, the stockpiling of soil, and the placement of erosion controls along the edge of the easement. And I've got you'll probably recognize these, but these are the drawings that were developed in the packet. There's two of them. One shows more of a three-dimensional view, and the other a plan view as well. So with these, we hope to kind of help visualize how the construction sequence would work, crossing wetlands. These details would help to describe how the soil will be stockpiled. We also provided additional details related to the restoration of wetlands, provide some seed mix specifications. I heard the mention of the New England seed mix. That's one of the seed mixes that's proposed for reseeding in wetlands. Clarified, environmental inspection during construction. We talked more about the dewatering aspect of the project and using a push-pull method to install the pipe. And then again discussed the feasibility of constructing within the easement, refueling, vegetation clearing, and then handling of excess soil. So there's a lot of ground covered with those comments, and there were quite a few on the construction side of things. And then also just discussing in more detail the aspects of the project related to the I guess temporary nature of the construction. And the last subject area for the comments related to, it's more of kind of there's a lot of different things in here, but information, for example, on public wells, requests for an emergency response plan, comments from the DCR. There was the wildlife habitat wildlife habitat evaluation, clarification on the easement, and these are all covered under this last topic area. And then an analysis of how the project would address the interests of the Wetlands Protection Act for each of the resource areas. So that's kind of a high-level summary of the information that we've provided, and we'd be happy to answer more specific questions that the
Right, and
commission
that's
might
what
have.
we'll go through. I think also we have, said Mike Herbert needed to.
Yeah,
make a
there's been
comment for us.
a development that we're not sure that you're aware of that happened Friday that doesn't directly impact this, but it does to a certain degree because it is the first note in Mr. Verrill's comments. So Michael, do you want to come up and explain this? Because this was something that was filed by the Board of Selectmen and not the Conservation Commission.
Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? I've emerged from the world of Triple E preparedness to giving you a public service announcement. So as Carl mentioned, one of the first things that I believe is in the peer review report, and something that has come up in conversation during the Conservation Commission hearings, is this subject of whether or not there should be, or there's allowed, one or multiple pipes within the easement. And it's central to the Conservation Commission's hearing because Eversource's application and their notice of intent is predicated on the ability to abandon one pipe into the easement while they go ahead and place and energize another one. And the ironic thing is that even though it's been central, I think, to, or one of the central points to the Conservation Commission's hearings, it's an issue that can't be adjudicated within the Conservation Commission, nor can it actually be adjudicated with the Energy Facilities Siting Board, where Eversource does have an application in there as well. So for the benefit of all parties, including Eversource, we felt like we needed to get some clarification on this issue. So as Carl mentioned, the Select Board filed on Friday, and I hope this isn't the first time that you're hearing this. I did get notice that Eversource was served this earlier today or Friday, but the Select Board has filed for, in land court, for declaratory judgment, whether or not, for the land court to determine whether or not there is allowed multiple pipes within this easement. So not sure exactly how long that process is going to take. I believe we're going to have a conference scheduled, or a scheduling conference, I should say, probably in 3 or 4 weeks. But again, we thought that this was best for all parties involved, so we could put this issue to rest. And I think that's, I mean, that's really all the information I have at this point in time.
Can you hold on for 1 second?
I want to ask them, Eversource, I wanted to ask you guys, did you hear about this? And secondly, how does that affect going forward for the hearing for now? Do we wait or do we continue? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that information.
Yep.
For the record, my name is Matthew Waldrop, environmental specialist with Eversource. This is the first we're hearing of that. We did have a project call today with our council, and we were not made aware at that time that this had been done. So we can't comment on that now because we don't have any information on that.
Okay.
So.
I guess, Mr. Waldrop, Kathy's question, if I understood it
We
correctly,
go forward
is do we go forward with this hearing with that in mind, or should we put this notice of intent on ice until we get an adjudication on that issue?
I think the company's preference would be to stay the course, because even if something came out of that adjudication that was not consistent with what we're proposing here, we would just have to withdraw this application and present you with a new one that was consistent. But the way these things typically work is, you know, we proceed with permitting, and then if something changes later, we just have to start over. The onus is on us to do that. So our preference would be, I mean, we intend to continue, is the short answer.
Okay, that's fine. We can go
Okay.
ahead.
Do Does Eversource have any questions for the town manager with regard to this?
And I apologize, you're just hearing about it now. I mean, it is a recent filing, but we were given notice that that complaint had been served today, so.
Okay, thanks, Marco.
Thank you.
Kathy.
Okay.
Before we start, I just want to make sure that I know that you sent the updated plans to the library. Have you also sent this document so the public can have the copy to read it through?
It's
They-
posted online. I posted it the day
You
that it was
posted on, but they
submitted on.
didn't send a printed one for them? Because I think in one of their emails, they had indicated that sent the plans to the library.
The plans are also at the library.
So, but did they send
And a copy of this printed.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So
Yes.
that's good they
Yes.
have.
The plans and the
And-
responses are at the
and
library and
online.
also
Alright.
posted online.
Both of them, yeah, that's what she's saying. Okay. Okay.
I do have some questions
Commissioners?
about the well, but I'll wait until anybody has the questions on the first three, and then
Okay.
I'll go through them.
Okay, so, starting with questions on the first section there, guys, anything that you guys have on those? Anything in there?
I have a number of questions with regard to all of them, and I don't know if you want me to just do them all at the same time, or. if
Go
you
ahead,
want
they
to
can-
answer.
is that okay
Did
with you
they-
guys? Let him
Yeah.
go, and then we can see if it covers ours or not,
Okay.
and we can
Yeah.
ask.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Does someone want to come up to the podium?
Well, I think they're gonna figure out which one has to come up to talk to you.
Well, you could both be
Depending
at
on
the
your
podium.
question.
It's just weird, I'm facing the podium and there's no one there.
It's gonna depend on your question.
Well, the first question had to do with the single pipeline. It was in your packet that you sent to us, it was page 7, comment 1. And this is a little bit of a moot point, given what was just, what we were just given notice of. But, bless you. My reading of this is, of your response, was not consistent with the question, which is not uncommon for people answering questions, is to kind of change the question. I think that and I don't want to get bogged down in this because we have in the last 2 meetings, but I think that this is key. The adjudication of this issue is key to everything else, because I think everything else is going to change depending on the outcome of this. It may change anyway, depending on the outcome of the language of the order of taking. So I will skip over that and go to my second point, which is not in your responses, but it's a general question with regard to something that we raised in the last meeting, that the single environmental impact report was approved by the secretary in September. We received this notice of intent in December. There have been quite a few subsequent amendments to that, both from our comments, but more specifically to Lucas Environmental's comments. Does that in any way make what was approved in the single environmental impact report moot, because they were considering different data?
So the answer to the question is no, it does not. As you're aware, there are certain triggers for MEPA that would require us to go back and they refer to it as a notice of project change, which it's essentially adding to the MEPA process that has already occurred, but we have not tripped any of those thresholds for this project.
Can you let me know what some of those thresholds are?
Well, there's a few of them. One, for example, would be a 10%. Some of them are quite vague, but one is a 10% increase in the project, which the scope of the project has not changed. And the other ones, that would be the one that's most relevant to this project. And the other ones we do not trigger either.
Who would be responsible for identifying those triggers?
It would be us, or any other state agency that, through filing of supplemental information, noticed a MEPA trigger
But
that was tripped.
But isn't that kind of like the fox guarding the hen house, if we're depending on you to identify the triggers?
So, Mr. Hackinson, I'm just going to go back to your question. The answer to the question is no. there were no triggers tripped. And if you don't believe us, I'd recommend, you have your agent or your counsel look into it as well, but I feel confident that they will come up empty-handed because no triggers were tripped.
Okay, thank you. Second question has to do with comment 2I of your responses on page 9 of your document. And it deals with the, something, again, that we brought up in the last meeting, the exposed pipe that's currently exposed in the stream channel. I believe, Mr. Waldrop, you said at the last meeting that you spoke with the fire chief or someone in town who determined that that was not a safety issue. Is that true?
We did have conversations with the fire chief. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep.
We did have conversations with the fire chief. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was the fire chief himself that deemed solely that that a condition was safe, but we did have conversations with the fire chief, and when those conversations subsided, we all felt confident that everyone understood that it was a safe condition.
Okay, well, this is kind of a little bit of beyond our purview of public safety. But the fact that it is a pipe in a stream bed makes it our purview. So it's kind of an overlapping jurisdiction. But because we are the only board in this town that's hearing this issue, I think it's important to bring it up. We couldn't bring it up if it were not jurisdictional for us. But I think, maybe everyone in the town would feel or anyone that's concerned about that might feel a little bit less concerned if we had some concrete evidence as to why that determination was made. I know that because if I lived at the end of Brimstone Lane, I would be concerned. So if that's possible for our next meeting, if you could do that,
Sure.
we'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, now
Mr.
back
Atkinson,
to...
can I ask for clarification on that question? What exactly was it you were looking for us to elaborate on what?
It was, one of you told us at the last hearing, and I believe it was you, Mr. Waldrop, because you did most of the speaking, but maybe it wasn't. When we brought that up, that it had been discussed with some board in town. I believe it was the fire chief or the fire department, it might have been.
Yes, they conducted a site visit, and I think what might help you most is if I actually forward you the email that a representative from your fire department
That
wrote.
would be fine.
That really, I think, would put this whole issue to rest, and we can move on to the
Yeah,
more wetland-related issues.
I think more for not necessarily for the purposes of this hearing, but for people's peace of mind in town with regard to
So
that.
in between questions, let me see if I can actually find that email, and if I do, I'll come up to the podium and read it so everyone can hear it.
Okay.
And that might obviate the need to bring it up
Okay,
at the
but-
next meeting.
Okay. Mr. Waldrop, this one's for you, I think, because we've had this discussion. Don't sit down too much. We talked about a limited project, and we talked about the state application of a limited project and how this was exempt under the state wetlands bylaw, and that it was not under the, state statute. It was not under the town bylaw. And correct me if I'm wrong, but believe you're requesting a waiver of at least, if not the bylaw, the 25-foot no disturb zone. Is that true?
Yes.
And that is not subject to something that's before the siting board, correct?
Yes, your local bylaw would be separate.
Yes. So I guess I would ask you why we would do that, given we just had a brief discussion in the previous hearing about our concerns of the 25-foot no disturb zone. Why would the commission do that in this case when, according to our bylaw, we are looking for if we are to waive it, improvements of the 25-foot no disturb zone?
So typically linear projects, by nature, I mean, we have to request waivers for any no disturb zones, because quite frankly, I mean, we have to go through the wetlands. There's no way of going around them on an already cleared easement unless we got new easement and went completely off route. What we see a lot of on our rights-of-way is you have a lot of disturbed conditions from when the pipeline was put in back in the 50s. So you have a lot of, whether it's invasives or other species that can be dealt with as part of the project. So oftentimes, I think you could argue that it could be an improvement over existing conditions. And I think it's certainly a waiver you could give us for the project. I mean, is there a reason that you would not? Could I ask that?
Yeah, because we've had this discussion before as it applied to other things that we've talked about, and you've had this discussion at the siting board as well, that you needed to have a noticed alternative. We have no information on the noticed alternative. I don't believe anyone has. So there are alternatives. They're barely noticed, but they're called noticed alternatives here. We are, I think, we've been kind of prodding you as to why this is a better alternative than the noticed alternative, and why we should grant a waiver of our 25-foot no disturb zone instead of asking you to put it in the noticed alternative.
So you're right, Mr. Hagginson, we have been through this before, and I think this is a matter, again, that's being handled at the EFSB level. And, you know, we've tried to keep this focus strictly on areas that are in the commission's jurisdiction, such as wetlands, but for sake of this conversation and the public, you have to consider, because of large projects like this, the state will consider other environmental resources other than wetlands, stuff such as human environmental impacts like traffic and noise, proximity to daycares, to schools. The noticed alternative route, those score a lot lower than wetlands. So it's, you know, we have an existing line here already, which is part of the reason why we chose this route, and it scored the highest according to our scoring because of those other reasons. For traffic, noise, sensitive receptors, and the other human environmental reasons. And the road, we still have buffer zones that we'd be in. It's not like it would completely obviate the need to come before you and get a permit. We would still have to get permits from you.
I realize that, but they may be less disruptive.
Sure, but
is what we're suggesting.
again, from your...
And you know, the fact that you kind of keep implying that I'm going off course here, you're about to put a pipeline through the largest wetland in our town. If we don't have jurisdiction over that, then we don't have jurisdiction over anything. And what we're saying here is there are alternatives to this that you're failing to consider, that we think that you should consider. So you can either answer the question or not answer the question, but don't blame me for asking the question.
So, Mr. Hackinson, I'm sorry it's coming across that I'm blaming you. I'm not, and I'm not disputing the fact that you have jurisdiction over these wetlands. That's part of the reason why we've been meeting with you since December of last year, is to discuss this. And I will say this again as many times as I have to, I can't contradict the legal proceeding that's going on with the EFSB that's completely separate from this. And if I did, it would get both myself and the town into a lot of trouble, because that process is standalone, and they consider what's happening locally, but we can't duplicate any scoring or any grading that was done as part of our petition for that. You know, that would be all be done through your council and through your intervenor status. That's the whole point, that the town has that. And I know you may not like that answer, but I can't do anything about, you know, the state processes and the way the processes are written. All we can do is make a good faith effort to come here and give you the information you've requested, which I believe we've done last time. I mean, the supplementary information you have is very comprehensive. So,
I have
You have more?
a couple more. I'll try to make them as brief as possible.
Okay.
One has your comment, let's see, this is comment 17 on page 17 of your response. And it has to do with Lucas Environmental's suggestion of proposed refueling locations. In your response is, exact equipment refueling locations cannot be predicted in advance and identified on the plans. The fact that a lot of, in zone 4, 5, and 6, which are the ones that are the most critical before this board, are either in wetland, on a public street, or on private property. I think it's important that refueling stations be identified, because there aren't too many places that you can refuel safely. You can't do it in the street, you can't do it on private property, and you shouldn't be able to do it in the wetlands. So I think, do you want to explain that answer, or why it's impossible to predict where the refueling stations would be, at least in the wetland areas?
So we've committed to obviously not doing the refueling in the wetlands or the buffer zones or the no disturbance zone. And when you take that out of the mix, it leaves basically upland jurisdictional, non-jurisdictional areas for that activity. But I think the intent there is to provide the contractor with some flexibility to select those locations based on site-specific conditions at the time. But it's within Eversource's best interest to maintain all the necessary controls for refueling, because the last thing anyone wants is to have any type of spill, number one, and especially a spill that's in a resource area or in a near a resource area that could get into that. So although they're not identified specifically on the drawings, it's really a way to provide some flexibility, but also commit to not putting them in wetlands, not putting them in buffer zones, things like that. I mean,
I'm sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I mean, we could shade out areas on the drawings, large swaths where it could be, potentially located. But, that's,
Well,
it's
I
a
think-
flexibility thing.
Yeah, I think if we're going to be monitoring, or someone's going to be monitoring this, and we're going to be part of that monitoring process, it would be helpful. I'm assuming that they're going to be in the easement, in the 20 or 30-foot easement.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we have the rights to be active on the line.
So at least in zones, and I'm calling them zones, I'm not exactly sure how you labeled them there, but it's 4, 5, and 6, and it's the area between 135 and Chestnut Street in that wetland complex there. If you're in the easement and you're not in a wetland, and you're not on private property, you're not in the street, there aren't too many other places to be. And so if those refueling sites could be identified, then when the monitoring took place, at least we would know, and the monitor would know, if you were actually refueling where you should be refueling. I think that's, this whole idea of doing this up gradient from all of this wetland complex is, I think, what concerns a lot of people. So if that could be possibly identified, it would be helpful. Stockpiling. You spoke to stockpiling, Mr. Waldrop. And I think that this question came up back in the first time we met. But other than renderings, are there any pictures of anyone in your project ever doing what you're talking about doing? Because, and it's raised in Mr. Verrill's comments on the next page, on comment 19, on page 18, whether this is feasible. It seems like it's hard to do a three-point turn in a 20-minute, in a 20-foot or a 30-foot easement without stockpiling and refueling and digging and storing all at the same time. It to me, it doesn't seem feasible, even though it may, in a bubble, in your plans. I have a hard time imagining this not being troublesome, particularly the fact that the most of the stuff that you're going to be excavating is going to be sloppy soil. It's not going to be hardened soil. So I guess, are there any pictures? Do you have any experience doing this type of project that we could see some kind of photographs of?
So, I have, personally speaking, I have quite a bit of experience with pipeline construction, albeit on larger cross-country lines with larger diameter pipe. So the construction area is larger than what is shown here. This is a small diameter pipe within a relatively narrow easement. So, any photos that I could show you would show you the same type of, because the same type of methodology that's shown here, this is what we would consider an industry standard in terms of pipeline construction, excavation of the trench, side casting immediately next to the trench, separating the wetland topsoil, usually the first 12 inches, into one pile, and then the subsoil right next to it to excavate the trench, and then having the pipe fabricated right on the mat and laid down in the trench. There's a couple unique, not unique, but the way this pipe is going to be installed is not like your larger projects, in that this is going to be done piece by piece, like they call it a stovepipe method, where the trench is excavated for usually a 40-foot length of pipe, or maybe 2, and then that's side casted, pipes installed, backfilled, and move on. So it's kind of an incremental, kind of creeping construction down the line. The drawings that we've got here, we're using, again, what I consider industry standards, in the sense that we're matting in the wetlands. Those equipment mats are usually made of, they're just wood connected. You've probably seen them before on other utility projects, to support the weight of the construction vehicles, to provide a stable and safe platform for those vehicles to work. The way that we've got that laid out here is to actually split the mats, and so you've got mats on one side of the easement, mats on the other side, and then there's a gap where the excavator would straddle that gap to dig the trench, which is about 2 to 3 feet in width, and about, say, 5 feet, because we're going to put 3 feet of cover over the top. Now, I totally acknowledge that not all soil is created equal. Obviously, you're digging in uplands and things like that, you're going to get a firmer soil. When you get into wetlands that have organics and it's very soupy, for lack of a better term, that soil is a little harder to manage. And so what we're proposing to do, one of the methods is, so we're proposing, obviously we've got the erosion controls on either side, we've got the mats, and we've talked about installing like a trough system, where if we get into an area where the soils are really wet, and they're moving around a lot, that we could actually put them in a trough prefabricated on the mats to keep them contained while the trench is excavated, the pipe's laid, and then they can be brought back in to backfill again in the same sequence, subsoil, topsoil. So that's one method that we're looking at as well.
So I guess, thank you. The people that are doing the excavating and people that are all doing it obviously aren't in this room. Do they have experience doing that, and could we have some kind of qualifications of what they're doing, or are they just, are you going to say you have to do this, and they're looking at me like, you got to be kidding me? And I'm not making light of that. I appreciate your explanation. It's just that if this project goes forward and we get people out there and it turns out to not look like what you're describing, we want to have to be able to say that, well, we asked these questions, and this is what the answers were.
So, So to answer your question, we don't have a contractor on board presently that we could show you physical qualifications for a certain contractor. However, the contractors that we would bid to or use for this type of work are this is what they do on an everyday basis. This is their specialty. So they do this type of work all the time, where they work in pipeline easements of varying widths and utilize these type of containment methods.
Thank you. I have one more question, Kathy, if you'll indulge me. And this has to do with the wildlife habitat evaluation. First of all, I appreciate Mr. Verrill's work on that. I thought it was very comprehensive, and your comments as well. I have two comments of my own, and I'm paraphrasing. This is not a paraphrase. Your comment was that it will have temporal impacts. Taken as a whole, that it will have temporal impacts, meaning temporary impacts. But what is defined as a temporary impact under the Wetlands Protection Act is things will be relatively back to normal, and correct me if I'm wrong, in 2 growing seasons.
That's correct.
And my issue here is I realize that wetland and wildlife wetland habitat is what we are charged with protecting, not the animals themselves. But it's hard to separate the wildlife from the wildlife habitat. And wildlife doesn't have the luxury of 2 growing seasons. When you get in there, things are going to move out. And what you're saying is they might move back in 2 years if everything grows back. But they might not, too. They might just not move back. I think it will have, and the other thing, and it's irrelevant what I think, your last paragraph in your original document, and I'll read it and then I'll be done. It says, implementation and intense monitoring of all best management practices will be critical for all work, especially when work is occurring near waterways and within impact areas 4, 5, and 6. These impact areas are hydrologically connected and are part of a higher value resource area identified in the evaluation. Unanticipated impacts to these areas could be extremely damaging, not only to the immediate resources, but to down gradient resource areas, including Willow Swamp and Sudbury River. And so I guess my concluding comment here is, and I am paraphrasing you now, to me that means if everything goes perfectly, everything should be okay. But most of us know that things don't always go perfectly. And if one thing goes astray here, all of this stuff is down gradient from where you guys are working. And that's a personal concern for me, because that area that you're going through, areas 4, 5, and 6, are probably the most biologically diverse areas in our town. And that's what our job is to protect those areas. So you don't have to comment on it, that's my comment on it. So thank you, Mr. Verrill, and thank you, Kathy, for indulging me.
Greg, do you want to go next, or do you want to do a lot?
Sure. Yeah, so last time we met, back in June, we were going through the peer review, and it seems like we kind of stopped short. Some of the stuff I wanted to chime in, it was more about mitigation. So, there's a letter in here from the DCR dated March 23rd, and they had asked some questions about inventorying all the invasives as well as the native species. And thank you, I saw in this packet that you had inventoried all the invasives, but was there a follow-up on inventorying all the native species? Just exactly what's there, kind of both sides?
So like you indicated, so we did conduct the invasive survey to identify all those species. We've got locational data as well of the areas where we actually took locations, you know, of clusters of plants in the easement. Just as another bit of information, we've also conducted an overall tree survey throughout the easement as well, which is a good kind of overall description of what's occurring within, you know, the easement in terms of, because there are some trees that have popped up along the edges. And then we have just general notes on the types of vegetation that are in the easement. But we don't have any, like if you're looking for like a plant community map, for example, because in a lot of the areas, the easement is, although it passes through wooded areas, it's relatively open, in barring some of the wetland areas and stuff where you can walk along relatively easily through there. So that's what we've got for information. And again, the native species that are across the easement are kind of typical of this area: red maple, red oak forest, white pine. Those are all common species along the easement. And then some of the shrub component as well.
On that note, Greg, if I may, did you map out everything that you found and reported, or did you just report and document to a list?
In the response, we just provided the species, whether they were inside or outside the easement. But we've also collected point data as well of the, you're talking about the invasives, correct? Yeah, we've got locational data as well.
Can I have a copy of that locational data?
Yes. Are you looking for it like how do you want that?
Shapefile through GIS if possible.
Okay, so you're not looking for like a figure, a map, or anything
Correct.
like that?
I'm looking for the actual raw data.
Okay.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rick.
So, yeah, one other comment. So DCR, I mean, are obviously a big player in this process, and I just feel like there's this disconnect. They just don't seem involved in this NOI, and I was just wondering if you can bring us up to date where you are with them as far as any requests. Has everything's been fulfilled for what they're asking?
So for the DCR, you know, we had heavy involvement with them through the MIPA process. They had representatives out on when we filed the expanded ENF with MIPA. We had meetings with the DCR in their office to kick off the project. And then we had interactions with the DCR as well related to the Ashland Reservoir Dam. We had to file a request for determination for them to evaluate whether we needed, a dam permit from the DCR, and they came back and said that we did not, based on the proximity of the project related to where the dam was and what we were proposing to do. So we've had that interaction. I provided you with the comment letters that we've received thus far. And there's also interaction with the DCR related to it's a special permit, right? That's the Article 97, the special permit. Yeah. So the DCR working with them related to a special permit area within, because there's two separate parts of their property that are crossed by the easement. There's a western one and then there's an eastern side. And so we're working with them as well related to the crossing of a special permit crossing near Cold Spring Brook. And the last thing I'll say is, so I did provide our contact at the DCR, Nathaniel Tipton. He's been our point of contact all along as it relates to the MIPA. I did provide him with a copy of the notice of intent, but I have not received any feedback or contact information from him on any additional comments on that.
Mr. Parquet, isn't there a if I remember correctly, in the environmental impact report, DCR exchanged, the special permit changed it to a permanent easement in exchange for a piece of property in western Massachusetts. Is that true?
That hasn't happened yet, but that's there was a mitigation proposal or a proposal for that. Because you're right, they wanted to convert that special permit into an easement. Because like I said, there's two pieces of property, DCR property, that are crossed in Ashland State Park. One is an actual easement, the other is a special permit crossing. And at their request, they wanted to convert that to a permanent easement.
Now, in order, is there a legislative process that needs to occur for that to happen, for them to trade parcels of land?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in that particular process, but yes, that Article 97 is
And that has
involves-
not happened?
That has not happened yet.
Thank you.
With the note of DCR, just so you know, I reached out to Mr. Tipton over the weekend saying that a notice of intent by Eversource was submitted. I reached out to him to see if there were any comments that he might have that are jurisdictional to the Conservation Commission. And I'm gonna be meeting with him as soon as he revisits his comments. So as soon as that comes up to par, I'll let you know and send an email out to the commission.
So there might be some, coming from them.
There may be. Note that we don't have a quorum right now with Mr. Hackinson
Nope.
stepped out.
You can hold up with it.
All right, we'll check our cell phones. Yeah.
Can I go ahead?
No, we can't, they don't
No,
have a
we
quorum.
gotta pause.
Oh,
yeah.
no, there's a quorum.
He stepped out. No quorum.
No quorum.
Okay.
Sorry. No quorum. Cannot continue.
You want to take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, we can take a 5-minute break if you want, yeah, that's fine.
Announce it.
Hmm?
Announce it.
We're gonna take a 5-minute break because there is not a quorum here at this point.
Do you want to
Yeah.
continue?
Yeah, I'll continue.
If you don't mind, I do
Oh,
have
sure.
one thing to add to the Article 97 discussion.
Mhm.
So in our conversations with DCR, they have agreed that the Article 97 process does not need to occur prior to construction. They would just like us to move forward with that legislation. So they have acknowledged that we have the existing rights under our special permit to construct the project. I just figured I would mention that.
Okay. Yeah, kind of on the same lines of mitigation, so, one question that we've talked about here a couple of times, and Matthew's brought it up, it's really trying to avoid the spread of noxious plants, and within the soils, there's going to be invasive seeds and roots and rhizomes. So when you stockpile that, it's gonna be there, and when you put it back, it's still gonna be there. So, other than just quickly spreading down New England seed mix, is that sufficient to stop the spread, the resprouting of these noxious plants? Because it's gonna be freshly turned over soil, there's gonna be a lot of exposed sunlight. I'm sure you've had experience with that. It's just, how do you mitigate that other than just planting something down that will outcompete it? Because it's not gonna go away, and it's probably not gonna die back. Is there a certain threshold of tolerance for us that we should consider in an order of conditions of how much invasive that resprouts in addition to the native plants?
Yeah, so the invasives issue is always a challenging one as it relates to the projects. So the condition that's out there now, where we've got, as you indicated, existing invasive species that are in the wetlands now, whether it's, some Phragmites or loosestrife. There's other areas with a lot of multiflora rose, bittersweet, along the buffer zone areas, things like that. The seed bank is there, it's in the soils. The advantage to doing this type of construction method is that you're not moving soils great distances. So you're excavating, you're stockpiling next to where you pulled the soil out, and then you're putting it back, as opposed to trucking it off or moving it down the line, something like that, where you could have a chance where you're spreading it where it's not. I guess, depending how you look at, I think pretty much every wetland that crossed has some level of invasive species in it. The species vary, but there are invasives there. And the challenge is, so not only are they in the easement, but in most cases, they're outside the easement as well. So, moving, if they're in the soil, then there's really, you're not gonna replace the soil, wetland soil, because there are other plants in there as well, native plants. And as you mentioned, doing an aggressive reseed of the wetland soils is probably your best bet. I've been involved with other projects where, there's the next options are ones that are not necessarily looked on with a lot of favorability, like herbicide treatments, things like that, to knock back invasives, and that opens up some other questions as well from a permitting standpoint. So you really are limited to trying not to make the problem spread around and make it worse, and that involves BMPs to clean equipment, make sure that mats you're bringing in to wetlands don't have chunks of soil lodged in there from another project site that have invasives in there. So you're in effect introducing some other species into an area. So and that's typically addressed through cleaning stations and certifying that mats are clean before they're brought on site. And as well as when you're moving mats, not taking up a mat that's been sitting in a Phragmites dominated wetland, now picking it up and dropping it in another wetland that has no Phragmites, and there's a good chance it's going to in the next couple years in that scenario. So it's important to monitor, where those mats are placed and how they're moved around and in the species, so that you don't, again, aggravate the situation.
Do you intend to wash those mats before you move them from one place to the other place?
Matt, did you want to talk about that? I know you have some specs. I mean, in areas where we've got like Phragmites in wetlands, those mats would have to be cleaned up before they would be put into
So you
another
take them
wetland.
out and clean them back and bring it?
Sure. So to answer your question, what we would typically do, we would have a water truck on site anyway for dust control, to suppress fugitive dust, and we would probably utilize that to wash the underside of mats that were in a wetland that was dominated by certain invasives to make sure that any root or seed stock was washed off. All of our matting contractors bring the mats on site, wash them prior to bringing them on site, so that they're usually good to go there. The onus is on us to make sure that if we do put it in a wetland that has invasives, that we wash it after the fact. Another method we sometimes use, it's not as effective, but it can be used to supplement the washing, is sometimes we'll pick up the mat and drop it, and the vibration will knock off any root or seed material, but the preference is to wash, and that's, I'd say 95% of the time what we would do, and we find it's pretty efficient.
Perhaps we could add some sort of a condition if we move to that point at any point in the future where we talk about areas that are gonna have those natural wetland seed mixes, that it be monitored, and that any invasive plants that are growing be removed, similar to what we've done in the past for like solar projects or other large-scale projects.
Who's doing this monitoring?
So
Is
one
this
of,
going to be like a monitor that's there during the whole project, or how does that work, Matt?
Well, I think in the case of invasive species, especially where the applicant has collected data to show where existing infestations are, you have some good baseline data that can be used going forward, and it's, you know, I think it's the commission's prerogative as to how stringent you want to be with a potential order of conditions for requirements for monitoring and mitigation and follow-up, and depending on how, you know, how long you want that to go on. Typically, in my experience, for any kind of wetland restoration or mitigation, it's being monitored at least for those 2 years that we discussed earlier. One, just to determine that, yes, it is recovering, but is it recovering with native species, or is it recovering with all invasive species? And I think there's the opportunity, as I said, to, you know, have the baseline data to know that, okay, in this, whatever, 100-foot section of the easement, there were no records or minimal records of, let's just say, Phragmites. Phragmites is, I think, in my opinion, sort of the worst one. So in this particular section, there was no Phragmites known. And then, okay, the project's done, they come back in year one and do some monitoring, and there's still no Phragmites. Okay, good. Maybe in year two, all of a sudden, some Phragmites starts to pop up in a couple areas. You can certainly have conditions that say that has to be addressed in some way, whether that's hand pulling or use of herbicides or other methods. You know, that's, to me, in my opinion, the issuance of your permit is, you know, that's what you can direct as far as how strict you want to be. If you want that monitoring to go out 10 years, that's your prerogative. I mean, Army Corps of Engineers has standards currently where monitoring of mitigation typically will be required to go out 10 years now. It's not necessarily every year. It may be years 1, 2, 5, 7, and 10, something like that. But, you know, it can be lengthy. So the other thing that I will mention, as you sort of brought up the issue of, you know, are you just going to seed it and then that's it? One of the, I guess, well, there's a couple things. As the applicant said, there should be, and I'm sure there is, a good seed stock in that soil when it's replaced, at both native species and invasive species. And hopefully the native species will pop fairly quickly when the conditions are correct. Adding the New England wet mix or some sort of a native seed mix will certainly help. Many of those seed mixes have somewhat a reputation of being slow germinators, and it'll actually say, if you ask the company that produces them, you know, how quickly will these respond? They say, well, you know, if you do it in the fall, you may not see much until the following spring or even the following fall. some of these seeds have to go through freeze and thaw cycles, things like that. So a lot of times it will be a requirement for a nurse seed. So meaning you plant something else that sprouts very quickly, that's not an invasive, but will give you good ground coverage to stabilize the soil, but also may help keep some of those invasives out while the natives can become established. But you know, invasive species control is always very challenging, and you know, I don't see a scenario where this project at the end where you say, oh, well, this worked out really well because now we don't have any invasives in this 20-foot swath going through town. That's not going to happen. But I think understanding where the bad areas are now and having some sort of assurances that those are not going to expand, at least in the short term. I mean, you know, as climate changes and things change, those may expand completely unrelated to this project. But I think having some assurances to say that this project is not going to result in those impacts, I think is an important thing to include in a permit.
What about monitoring beyond invasive species, though, monitoring day-to-day leakage of refueling or hydraulics or any of that stuff? I mean, is that something?
Yes, I believe the applicant would have an on-site monitor, an environmental monitor that would be looking at those things basically the entire time the work is going on. I don't want to speak for you, Matt, but.
Yes, I'll answer part of the question, then I may defer to Mr. Berthium to answer the other half. We do have a SWIP, a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, under the Construction General Permit that's issued by EPA. That requires at a minimum weekly inspections it will be done by TRC, our environmental consultant, or I believe it is after every quarter-inch rain event or greater. We'd have to do a rainfall inspection to check on the construction site as long as there is exposed soil. We will have other representatives on site that will be environmentally trained. They may not be, quote-unquote environmental scientists or professional wetland scientists. They will be contractors that are going to be on site full-time that will be trained. We'll go through an environmental training that we give. Sean, do you want to speak to any other monitors we would have that will be inspecting work?
In addition to what Mr. Waldrop said, usually someone from the contractor crew, most likely the foreman that is responsible for the overall work that is being conducted, will also go through that similar training, will also be responsible for that monitoring. In addition, we will also have an engineering inspector that's keeping an eye on the physical installation of the pipeline, who will be another level of protection, if you will, someone supervision to keep an eye on things like that.
So did you say, Mr. Waldrop, that it's a weekly inspection?
Yes, sir, a weekly inspection, or say, for instance, if our weekly inspection was on a Monday, but then Monday evening we got a half inch of rain, we would have to go out Tuesday and do another inspection. So it's a week minimum weekly inspection, or after any rain event greater than a quarter inch, we would have to have a SWIP inspection. But that's not, Mr. Berthium's referring to just the general personnel that would be on site doing daily inspections.
If I just add to that, again, you guys are the ones issuing the permit, so you can have whatever special conditions you want with the understanding that the applicant also has the ability to appeal those special conditions if they feel it's onerous. But I certainly have seen projects where there is a requirement for a daily inspection by an independent third-party contractor that's hired by the commission or hired by the applicant, as approved by the commission, and that person's out there on a daily basis keeping an eye on things.
Thank you.
Do you currently monitor that easement area?
We don't monitor for
So-
spills or anything like that, but we do quarterly leak survey inspections where we look for any gas leaks or some stuff
So
like
like-
that. But
Not for the leak, I think, but I meant about the invasive species. Have you tackled them? Have you handled them at all in the past X number of years?
So the short answer is no. If there's really no work going on in the right-of-way, we typically do not, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. We do have a yearly operation plan as part of it's more on the electric side than gas, where we will it's part of our vegetation management plan, and sometimes that involves dealing with invasive species. But one thing I was going to mention a minute ago when you were discussing invasives, if it does involve use of herbicides, we actually can't spray any herbicides on our right-of-way unless we have approval from Department of Agriculture. They have to approve it, but in the event that they do approve it, we will, utilize it by a licensed herbicide applicator to control things like invasives. But if there is no project work going on and these certain rights-of-ways aren't part of our yearly operation plan for maintenance of vegetation, it would be, left alone. But on the electric transmission side, it's more of the concern, in the event that you do have, sometimes Phragmites can grow, 20 feet tall, and you don't want to have certain trees and other vegetation growing up into wire zones. So it's more of an electric transmission concern to keep the clearances.
Not because of the invasive species is there.
If
That's not the reason, but they want to safeguard their
yes, I mean,
utilities. Okay.
if we do have an opportunity to treat invasives as part of that process, we certainly will, and certainly we have conditions from commissions all the time to treat invasives as part of project work, and the company's very accommodating to that. If you want to see certain conditions for how you want to see the invasives dealt with, that's in our best interest to do that as well. So we can commit to that, provided that it's within reason.
You still have questions?
Oh, go ahead.
You're all
KJ.
set. Right,
Okay.
Yeah, you can go.
Let me go back to section 1.4, regarding the public wells and private wells. You have indicated that you've used the data from our Board of Health here,
Correct.
and I do know that the data that we have is not complete. Have you ever gone to the Energy and Environment Affairs database to look at it? Because Ashland has 212 wells on their website with all the data.
We access the Mass GIS database for well locations, as well as, like you just indicated, talking to the Board of Health representative about existing databases within the town, and we were provided a list that we cross-checked.
That's not the entire list.
Okay. But we
The
weren't
Ashland
aware.
has 212 wells according to the Energy Environment Affairs database. So you should be able to access that and then correct that if it's within the jurisdiction of your line here.
Yeah, like I said, everything we've accessed, which is, I think we're talking about the same database that you just mentioned with the 212. And we've checked it and nothing pops up, at least from our review,
Because
in
that
the easement.
doesn't say on your thing, you said you relied upon mostly Mark Orum's or the Board of Health here. It doesn't say about cross-checking with the state data.
We have looked at that too. I thought it was mentioned in this
No,
response.
it's not mentioned there.
Okay.
So
But
need
that's
correct
usually the
that.
first, that's usually the first cut that we'll make when we do a
But
data,
that's-
a well search.
That's not explained in this sheet,
Okay.
to make sure that you have exhausted that list also, to making sure that.
Well, we can clarify that for
Okay.
you in writing.
All right, and then I have a couple more questions. Let me go back to that. Next one is regarding the one pipe, two pipe issue, but I know that's not my concern, or that I shouldn't be concerned about it. But in my opinion, the wording that you've used, replace, doesn't make good sense for public here. You are providing another parallel path for the gas transmission by installing another pipe rather than replacing the pipe. That's what you're doing. And leaving that comment there, how do you propose to monitor the abandoned pipe? If there's leak of water into it and then it takes away the groundwater from one area to the other area, you know that water goes through a least resistance path, and then the pipe is definitely a least resistance path compared to the ground. So how do you monitor it?
So we would be capping it, and it would not be monitored, with the understanding that it's, it's just an abandoned pipe in the ground. We have gotten requests in the past to fill pipes with some type of either grout or foam, some type of filler, just to make sure that, it's not the case here, but in the event that there was miles of pipe that were cut, we would, just to make sure that it doesn't act as a conduit to bring like contaminated material from point A to point B. I mean, we don't have any activity use limitations along the property or any contamination we know of, but that could be something that can certainly be done, that we've done in the past.
You're not chopping up every pipe and then capping it, you're just capping it from one end to the other end, that's all twice, right?
We capped at the end, start and end of each construction
Correct.
season.
But the pipe could break in between, crack in between, or have a leak inside, so it could take the water in and then leak it out somewhere else, is that right?
I suppose so.
So-
As Mr. Waldron mentioned, we have considered in the past filling or grouting an existing pipe. That is something we've considered, but the caps that we would use would be welded caps and not a foam or.
Cap is only protection at one end of it. The length of the
Correct.
pipe is not protected by any means.
Understand,
Or the joints between the subsequent pipes are not protected.
understand.
So how would you protect that, how would you monitor the water going into it?
As Mr. Waldron mentioned, it could be something that we could consider as part of the mitigation proposal to fill the existing pipe with a grout or some other method.
So would you send that method to us in writing? What methods would you consider?
We could do that.
I can add to that too. And Mr. Nayanar, just to clarify as well, I mean, once it's plugged with some type of grout or foam, grout is what we'd use, grout, there's really not much we can do to monitor it at that point, because we can't, there's no way to fit any pig inside the pipe or check it. And, we would, short of excavating, to do an inspection, which really doesn't make sense from an environmental
I
perspective.
understand.
But we
If
can
the-
send you the methods for
Yeah,
it.
if the volume of the pipe is filled, the less likely that more water will get into.
Yes,
But if the volume is
absolutely.
not filled, there is more likely that more water will get to it.
Yes, I mean, if it's
So
filled
it's
contiguously.
better than empty pipe.
Yes, I agree. I think we're on the same page with that.
The next question that I have is the exposed pipe section. You had indicated that you're going to put it in the stream, try to put it under 5 feet, if not 3 feet. If you don't get 3 feet, what do you do?
Excuse me?
It's on page 9 of your answers.
Yes, I just wanted to check with Mr. Berthium, because has more of an engineering understanding than I do. I mean, it would be buried at 5 feet, and we have no reason to believe that it would not be
But
buried
you
at
also
5 feet.
indicated that if you don't get the room there because of ledge or a rock or something, you will take the 3 feet. That's
Yes.
what you said, but if you don't get that 3 feet, what do you do?
Well, I assume we would have to do some type of, we would have to get the 3 feet. We could not have it shallower than that. We would have to, I mean, it's unlikely because it's a stream bed area, but, I mean, if we did hypothetically hit some type of ledge, I mean, we would not be doing any blasting at all. I just want to say that for the record, because that's often a concern that the public has, and that, we have blasting in proximity to an active line. But we would do some type of, it would probably be some type of saw cutting, is my understanding. Excuse me. Some type of hammering.
Yeah,
or
why
saw
wouldn't you
cutting.
hammer it for 5 feet? Why only 3 feet?
No, he said 5 feet.
No, it's 3 feet if you don't get 5 feet, that's what they said. But if
Yes.
you're hammering it for 3 feet, what is wrong in hammering for 5 feet?
Well, I mean, it's more disturbance that, it can be
Right,
obviated.
if they
we
can live with 3
three.
feet of disturbance, they can definitely live with 5 feet of disturbance.
I mean, if you want us to hammer and saw additionally to get extra depth, I mean, that's something we can consider, but
If 5 feet
typically-
is safer and better, then we better have for 5 feet or 3 feet, rather than 3 feet.
I mean, if the board wants to see that, I mean, it's gonna be prolonged time to do
Mhm.
that, but we can do it, for sure.
All right, and also you said you want to cut the pipe on the one that is already there. Why
Yes.
would you want to cut it when nothing is going inside? because of aesthetic look or something, or is that the reason?
I mean, based on the comments we've gotten from the town and from the public, we think it would behoove us just to cut it and take it out of the stream. I mean, right now, when you look at it, I mean, from your perspective, when you look at the performance standards for bank, it's really not adversely affecting the carrying capacity of the bank, the ability for the bank to provide, to hold its peak flows in or to provide wildlife habitat function. It's not really adversely affecting the interests of the act, and as we mentioned before, it's not a safety issue, so that's why we haven't dealt with it. But since we're gonna be in there doing work, it's not gonna be a big effort just to cut it and remove it to obviate the need for future questions on it or any concern from the public. I mean, it's a small piece of work at that point for a larger gain, even though there's no safety or environmental risks. It's just more of a question of why not do it at that time.
Right. Another question I have is, if the pipeline was not going in the wetland, if it's going on the upland somewhere else, would you have removed the 6-inch pipe?
Sir, I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you talking about if it was
the pipeline
exposed
was not
outside of
going-
the stream?
If the pipeline was not going through the wetland at all, if it were originally laid out elsewhere, which is not a wetland, would you have removed the 6-inch pipe in order to install the 12-inch pipe?
So are you talking about if this pipe was exposed in a different
No,
area?
no, the entire pipeline, transmission line itself that you have. If it was not in the wetland, if it happened to be in a dry place and dry land, upland area, would you have removed it rather than leaving the pipe there? Would you have removed that and put a 12-inch?
I think the answer to your question is no, that we wouldn't, because, I mean, it doesn't really make a difference if it's wetland or upland. If it's buried under the ground, it's not adversely affecting the interests of the act because it's been there since the 50s. It's not, there's no surface alteration to the wetlands, so we would see no need to remove it.
All right. So it doesn't cost more when you're removing it on a...
Oh, I'm sure it would be an increased cost and increased environmental impact, which is part of the reason
Well,
why.
here it will be improved and environmental impact, but on the status when there is completely dry land or upland area, then you wouldn't have any issue with that.
Well, I
There's
suppose
no
I would.
increased cost when taking out and putting a new pipe.
I would disagree with that assertion. I don't think it would improve the environmental impacts to remove the line. I think it would be increased temporal impacts to remove a line that's been there since the 50s.
I'm not talking about this particular line. Forget about this. I'm saying that if this pipe originally had been laid on the upland, would you have removed the 6-inch pipe? That was my question.
No.
talking about
The answer to your question is no.
All
Do you
right.
have any more, Benji?
None.
None? Okay.
Thank you.
My questions. You have right now an application in front of the Ashland Planning Board for the scenic road. Do you know when that expects that to close or complete?
Just a moment. What date are we on here?
The hearing was continued to September 12th, if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds correct. So we have met with them one time, and they wanted to continue just for purposes of site visit. We didn't really have any major
Issues as
concerns
far
come
as
out of that hearing because it's limited to just the scenic roads and some crossings of stone walls.
Okay. Everywhere that you're talking about doing things in the wetlands, you're talking about that things will happen quickly, it's temporal. In one place it said 8 to 10 weeks. But then all of these areas are also what's called you want to do it at low flow times. Low flow time is July 1st to February 28th. Are you working all the way into February 28th when nothing will grow? You're not working in the wetlands.
Currently, our construction season is proposed from March till November and
Okay.
not during the winter months.
Okay. Now, if you end up being in November in a, basically, this restricts you in the wetlands to go July 1st to November, though. So, you're gonna have to time it appropriately. Secondly, if it's in October and November, and it's a cold October and November, whatever you seed will not grow at that point. What are you going to do to make sure that that happens in the spring? What are the plans for that?
Ma'am, can I ask you to repeat the question? I apologize, I missed the first
That's
piece of
okay.
your question.
He's saying right now you're gonna work March through November. Low flow, which are the wetlands, really you cannot work except for July 1st to February. So you really, July 1st to November is gonna be your restricted timeframe for working in the wetlands. If you end up working in the wetland October to November, and if it's a cold October, November, whatever you seed will not grow.
Sure, so it may, that's a good question. It may not grow at that time, but come the growing season, it may. What we would do, the main concern is making sure that once we seed, after a rain event, we don't get any type of erosion event that's gonna wash away any seed, any native seed that we've put down to reestablish that area. So we would cover it with straw or some other type of, straw blanket or erosion control to prevent that seed and that soil from eroding. If it's on a slope, sometimes we have used things like tackifiers, which is essentially a glue to make sure that that straw doesn't wash away. And then you do have to consider the possibility too that getting in towards late November, December, you may have some freezing of the ground. And then of course, the rest of the winter, you're gonna have frozen ground and snow cover, so the chances of erosion at that point are pretty minimal. But come the spring, if we did not see any regrowth of the seed, like if the seed did not go dormant and it just died, we have no problem in reseeding at that point and monitoring it. So the
Okay, so you
seeding,
would
the
be-
seeding's a living situation. If we see that an area hasn't established, we would go back and seed it again.
The other major thing was the drilling and the oil coming from the drilling. The HDD drilling fluids and spoils can present an additional challenge when crossing beneath wetlands and water bodies. That's all you said, so what are you gonna do?
Well, ma'am, I believe
Didn't
that,
say that.
my team can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe we're doing any HDD. So that, what you just mentioned was part of the HDD procedure, and it's not being done for this project. It was presented just as an alternative method of wetland crossing.
So you're using the jack and bore method? Is that what you're using?
No, ma'am, it
Or
would
not?
be just conventional,
Okay.
direct bury of the pipe.
Okay, all right, good, so there shouldn't be any oil or from those type of things, right?
No, ma'am. It would be a
Okay.
bentonite clay mixture is what we would use, which oftentimes they would use it historically to drill drinking water wells. So it's commonly used in this industry, but it would not be used for this project.
Okay, I think that was the major ones I had, okay. You guys all set, too? Yeah, I'm gonna, yeah,
For now, yeah.
all
We
right.
have a few comments too.
Who?
We have a few
Okay,
comments too.
go ahead, please.
Sure, if you want. There was, in the comments, there was a discussion of this push-pull method of installation. I was wondering if you could, the document didn't really kind of describe that all that well. And I just think for the commission and the public's benefit, if you could just kind of describe it a little bit more detail how that would work.
Sure. I will defer to my colleagues for that one. Push-pull method?
Good evening. I'm Ken Stanley of Tremont Engineering. Push-pull methodology is a process where it may be one piece of pipe or it could be multiple sticks of pipe, depending upon how much workspace we have, where we could pull from one side with an excavator or cabling or a vehicle while pushing the other side from the back end as well. So taking the pipe and pushing it through the open trench. And by pushing and pulling at the same time, minimizing the amount of disturbance we would have in the trench by means of controlling the weight on one end versus the other end. I think that's the best way I could describe it at this point. But we would weld up enough numbers of joints that we had available workspace prior to the wetland and or through the wetland.
So I think the description in the document said that using this method would allow less requirements for dewatering.
Yes, it would, because the ends would be closed and the pipe would have some air in it, therefore creating some buoyancy. And then once the pipe is in place, we do have set-on weights that we're using in the wetlands to keep the pipe from floating above that or floating out of the water. So we can put the set-on weights on top and it would sink it down into the trench.
And then do you have to de-water to actually weld the pipes together, or?
We would leave the end available in the air, we'll say, above the water line, so that it can be welded outside the
Okay.
water line or disturbed area.
Another question I had was, again, you talk about this wooden trough concept for potential storage of soils. I'm envisioning a horse drinking out of a wooden trough, and I don't think that's what you're intending. Can you describe a little bit more sort of how that would be manufactured, if you've used it before? How deep, how wide, how strong?
So the trough, as it's been called, what we would do is the timbers themselves are wooden timbers that it's anticipated using. And we would create a barrier on the outside and on the inside so that it'd be a figurative trough area to maintain the soils from spilling off the mat itself. The contractor, we would ask or require the contractor to show us how he would install that so it would not be non-functional why that was happening through the wetland. But the concept of that would be is to create a barrier on both sides of the spoil area so that it doesn't spill off or into your workspace. The height of that would be determined on what type of soil, how wet it is, per se.
And that will also determine the length of trench that you would have to put the number of pipes there to weld them together, right?
Could you
The size of that trough would
Well-
fix the quantity of matter that you can put it inside. That will determine the amount of material that you're going to take out of it, so it fixes your length that's available for you to work at one time.
The intention would
So-
be,
So then the number of pipe that go inside also limited by whatever that is taking.
yeah, the intention would be is that where we would normally have a spoil pile, the trough would be of the same size. And obviously, we would use the length of the matting throughout the parallel length of the trench to let that soil migrate throughout so that we could contain it from spilling into our workspace, but also close the ends so it doesn't spill off at the ends. But it would be the similar volume of what we would normally see with the spoil pile in a dry situation.
So presumably this technology's been used before, even if in some of these larger pipeline situations?
It's uncommon, but it's been used.
Okay, I think the commission might wanna see some evidence of that.
Sure, I thought
I
they
mean,
would have come with
somebody must
a
have a picture.
video of all the process that they would do it on that day. Should have been media event rather than just describing it.
Yeah.
The other thing is that are the lengths of these pipes are 40 foot
Typically, yes.
typically. So when you are trying to weld the two of them or three of them together, when you have a situation like this, the length is more. So you will have the trough that longer.
Yes. It would go the length of the workspace available to us and/or the trench length we have open.
So, if I may, so you had said that it wasn't really common in the practices of utilities. What else is common other than using a wooden trough that you've seen in your experience?
Actually, the methodologies that we've provided are very common to the industry and have been successful in the past.
But you just said that it wasn't common for the barrier.
No, I'm saying the trough.
Okay, so what's common, a common alternative to the trough?
The methodology that we're using currently is a common successful method.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So I've been involved with some other projects, in some of the other methods that have been employed, like actually driving sheet piling to fortify or form a barrier on either side of the trench. And that's a pretty intensive effort for a lot of reasons, in terms of equipment, actually driving pile, which is extremely noisy. And at the end of the day, you've got a fixed structure, so to speak, but then it's gotta be removed and stuff. So something that intense in this narrow easement, we looked at that. We figured that the trough is kind of along the same lines, but more in line with the magnitude of the workspace and what we're doing here. And then Matt had mentioned the installation of they call it super silt fence, which is, it's silt fence, but it's backed up with I've seen different specs for where you actually you can install chain link fence and back it up against that. And it's pretty beefy stuff that is
Can we
more.
get a spec sheet on that or something on the super silt fence, and also on the wooden trough, maybe a drawing or something that explains it, and also explain it?
Yes.
Something like that would be good, I think, for us.
Are these trenches 5 or 6 feet deep or what?
Yeah, the typical trench depth, so, with the goal of 3 feet of cover with a 12-inch pipe, so you're looking at 4 to 5 foot
Perfect.
depth at
Yeah,
the bottom of the trench.
whatever that you fill it in the trough will be emptied the same day, or would stay there overnight?
I think it depends on the what the specific condition of construction is at that time, with if it can be all done, one section done in one day. Sean, did you want to speak to relative rates of progress?
I was just gonna say, we don't plan to leave any open trenches at the end of,
Not the trench, I meant the trough.
so the soil that would be placed in the trough, the intent was that it would be placed back in the trench the same day, so that way the trench could be backfilled.
Okay,
So
but
there
if,
would
if,
no soil outside of a trench at the end of a day, really, is what you're
no,
saying?
in the trench, they would fill the trench, that's what they say, they're going to
Right.
keep it safe enough.
So you wouldn't
Correct.
have any soil outside of the trench? At the end of the day, the trench would be filled?
Correct. We don't expect any, there may be some excess soils, but we don't expect that.
It should
The,
fill all
the
that.
reason I asked is because I don't want any liquid to be present in the trough, so that any wild habit that gets in there jumps inside and dies or something, then we don't want to have that situation.
And if there is
Bring it
excess
cover
soil,
Oh.
if there is excess soil, it would be taken off-site. It wouldn't be left
Not,
overnight.
soil, I'm not concerned about it, probably they will walk on top of it, but the water, if there is any inside.
I have a question, getting back to that push and pull thing, before we get too far away from it. Clarify this for me. The mats are going down, are the mats for instance, sections 4, 5, and 6, are they all going down at the same time, or are they going down as you guys excavate? And is it 2 sets of mats with a section open in the middle where the excavation is ongoing? Is that right so far?
I can answer your question. So, the mats most likely will all go down through that section of the wetlands at once, and not be placed as we progress, most likely be done at once. And you are correct that there'd be 2 separate mats with a space in between for the trench.
Okay, now, you talked about the excavated soil washing off to the sides. Is there also some kind of mitigation to keep the excavated soil from washing back into that middle section that you're talking about?
Meaning the trench.
Or is that just the trough would hold it from going either direction?
If the trough was utilized, it would stop it from going either direction. Outside of the trough, the silt fence or hay bales, things of that nature would be
But
used.
the hay bales would protect the edge, but would you have more hay bales in between the tracks of the excavator?
Not likely, but the
Do
trough.
you know what I'm talking about? I mean,
I
just-
understand, I understand what you're saying.
Is there anything to protect that soil from coming this way instead of going that way?
We would use like a silt fence or something of that nature. The soil has to be kept back. It can't be left
And the
right.
excavator would straddle that silt fence?
Correct.
Okay.
And it wouldn't be, the soil can't be left right up against the open edge of the trench for safety reasons. They don't want that sliding back in, so it has to be kept. I don't know the distances off the top of my head, but depending on how deep your trench is and how deep your soil pile is on the side, it has to be kept a certain distance away.
Okay, thank you.
You also mentioned that when the soil comes out, you're gonna be stratifying it, topsoil in the middle. So when you do end up with excess soil, because I imagine you would, because a 12-inch pipe will, you can calculate the volume pretty easily.
614 cubic yards per
Okay.
mile.
Yeah, okay.
Very easily,
Wow.
apparently.
Yeah. So you're gonna anticipate soil coming out. Which strata do you choose to truck out? You keep the most organic, and then what's less organic, is that what comes out?
Sure, that's a good question. So, I think the short answer would be it's a case-by-case basis. Most of the time, we're not actually, contrary to popular belief, we probably won't have access because we may be pulling things in boulders, and things of that nature out, so, that would fill some of those voids back. But our intent would be, especially in wetlands that are more inundated or where there's a strong native population, to prioritize the amount of topsoil we put back, just because that contains all the root and seed material. So if we do observe when backfilling that we may be approaching capacity, like we won't, how much we need to backfill, we might, if there's some spoil left over, we may put topsoil back in first and then take the spoil off site. But it's a case-by-case basis. It really depends on how quickly we're backfilling the trench, and it's a decision that will be made more or less in the moment.
So if the person is making the decision in the moment, that's gonna be that foreman that's gonna be on the job, so you're gonna be training him to be able to know this type of thing? That's the training
Yes,
he's gonna have to go through?
So all of our contractors have to go through, well, this project likely, I believe it's going to be competitively bid, so that's gonna include an environmental section. In order to work on this project and to be hired, they're gonna have to go to our compliance trainings, submit, technical documentation that shows their workers have either done this, or if they haven't done it, are willing to be trained on it. The contractor, in order just to work for us, would have to do that. And then once they're on board and they have a purchase order with us to actually do the work, we would put them through a compliance training that would be conducted either by myself or by TRC. So if the instance does come up like this, where, an environmental presence is not on site because we don't have a SWIP inspection occurring, or if the town's representative is not on site, they would be adequately trained to make that decision in the moment. And again, it's a case-by-case basis.
I just have one more thought for now. On the graphics that you have, that you presented to kind of show, yeah, that one right there. I think that's great. My only concern is that it says right on it's not to scale. And to me, sort of the whole point of having that is to have it to some sort of a scale, and I understand that it's being reasonable that, the size, I did some measurements on it, and the size of the truck seems about right and everything, but I think having some real dimensions on some of these things, and as the commission mentioned about, potentially a specification on the wooden trough or things like that, so that, everyone can understand that, yes, all this stuff is going to fit in. I know that one of the comments in the response was, well, back when it was originally put in, it was put in the easement. I would be willing to bet that in the 1950s, nobody was looking too closely exactly how wide that easement was when the pipe was going in.
There weren't that many people around there either.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
there
part
was
of the
no
thing.
permits
You're
needed.
saying 1950 versus now, it's like,
So, Mr. Verrill, when you say it's not to scale, I don't see where, this is to scale. Did you see a note somewhere that said it was not?
Doesn't it say right out, not to scale?
It says issued for permit, so
Yeah,
this,
no, above that,
Right underneath
right
that
underneath where it says
wetland workspace illustration, not to scale.
not to scale.
Yeah.
That probably needs to come off.
So what we can do is, and we'll provide
Measurements
clarification.
and stuff.
The workspace, the vehicles, and the configuration inside the workspace is to scale. I think
Okay.
our developer probably left it in because of the shrubbery and things like that around it, and it is not necessarily to scale. However, we can provide more detail to say, more dimensioning. So you
yeah,
can
I think that would be helpful.
But they are, just make a point, they are to scale.
Yeah.
okay.
So we can, thank you for catching that. We can have that note removed.
And
Sounds like from
dimensions
Ken.
and stuff put on there.
Yeah, sometimes in CAD or SketchUp that they use to create these programs, these shrubs, anytime we add like the fluff to the drawing, sometimes that will trigger it to have the label not to scale, but this is to scale.
And you're gonna add dimensions though on some
We
of the
we
trucks
can
and
do,
stuff.
we can do that,
Okay.
sure. We have the width of the right of way,
Yeah.
and the intent of this figure was to, to make it as simple as possible for you to understand, just because, not everybody reviews the engineered plans, but I'd refer to this as like a cartoon figure that, if we put the dimensions on, I hope it will help you understand that we can do the work within the,
I think it'll
within
help
the
a little bit
limits.
more.
They're also standard equipment. That what the contractor's gonna use per se may fluctuate based on what type of.
Yeah, a bit, but they're
equipment
still
it
gonna
is
have
now.
to stay
Well,
within that
it would
pretty
have to stay.
closely.
That's correct. And would have to
They
fit
don't have
the
much.
configuration that we're.
Yeah.
Right, they don't have
And-
much room to move.
Yeah, and earlier, Mr. Hackinson had mentioned that, I think you referred to three-point turns or some other maneuverability. We wouldn't be doing any of that in this setup. It's just gonna be in and out,
Forward or back.
forward or back. We wouldn't, obviously, we wouldn't have the room.
Yeah. Jim, Matt, any more?
That was all
That's
for
all.
this evening.
Megan?
Okay, thank you everybody for hanging in there with us. I know you're getting tired and I'll try to make my comments quick. Matt, one of the things that I've noticed is that there's some discrepancies where you go through, where in the responses from TRC to our comments, there's many different methods that are discussed, that are mentioned, nothing is really described. But when you look at your plans, it looks like a discrepancy against that, because some of the methods that are mentioned are push-pull and stovepipe, but looking at the plans, everything is open trench. Can you explain the differences there?
Do you wanna explain that? I'll defer to.
In practice, an open trench is the kind of overarching methodology for the what's being proposed here. When I mentioned stovepipe, that's a specific type of an open trench construction approach to it. So that it's kind of a subset of that.
For each wetland resource area that's crossed or proposed to be crossed under this notice of intent, should those details demarcate specifically what kind of detail would be used for that crossing and for the open trench methods? Because right now, it looks like it's just a vague open trench method detail. It doesn't specify the type underneath it.
I mean, we could certainly notate, that it's gonna be like a stovepipe / push-pull, to be confirmed at the time of construction based on conditions, whether, if we're in a really, because obviously some of these segments are pretty far out there in terms of the years that they'll be constructed, 3, 4, 5 years from now. So the conditions could be different in terms of water levels, things like that, where the contractor could choose one method over another, where like a push-pull wouldn't be necessary if the wetland is dry for all intents and purposes, and they can go with a traditional open cut, just standard approach to it and not have to do that. So typically, we like to provide a little bit of flexibility that on the drawings to say it's gonna be one of these two methods based on site conditions at the
Okay.
time of construction.
So are you suggesting a condition in the order of conditions that talks about revised plans being submitted at the time of pre-construction?
What do you wanna do there?
I mean, Ms. Dos Anjos, I would say no, because we can't really, we provided a list of methods with the understanding that you could review all of them, and then it's gonna depend on field conditions. Field conditions might be conducive to stovepipe, it might be conducive to push and pull. We won't really know until we get in there. And there's a limited type of characterization we can do to determine that. I mean, we could pop 100 boreholes in there and maybe come up with what we could do, but it would be inefficient to do that, and we still may only provide data at certain points. There's really no way of knowing until we get in there. I would suggest we could provide you updates during construction on which method we have used at each crossing, and then we'll tie that into our compliance reports and send you copies of the reports for your files. That way, you can ensure compliance with whatever crossing we do use, but it's, we don't have a crystal ball, and we can't, you can't really tell until you get in there whether or not what method's gonna be the correct one to use.
Okay. One of the notes for the commission here is that on page 3, comment number 14,
Yeah, sidewalk.
you're all there?
Mhm.
Okay. That comment had to do with a site walk that was held previously with myself on August 8th of 2018. TRC's response was that a detailed peer review was conducted by Matt Verrill and also with TRC present. Toward the end of that response, they note that if the commission deems it necessary, the applicant will attend another site inspection. So I just wanted to check in with you if you feel that might be necessary.
I don't know, guys. What do you guys think? Another one or not? You're on page, you know where, you see where it is?
14 down there on the end.
I don't think so, I mean. I think we agreed with the wetland flags, we went and saw some of them.
Well, we did, but the
Areas.
site walk of August 8th missed an entire complex, correct?
Correct.
That has subsequently been identified.
Right,
But I think
and they revised those.
with Matt's inspection of the wetland flags, it's probably not necessary for us to
Okay. Yeah, I don't,
do a further site walk.
Yeah, I'm confident that all the wetlands that are out there and subject to regulation have been identified and
delineated.
are accurately described.
okay, yeah, I don't think so
Yeah.
either.
Get rid of
Yeah,
that one.
yeah, I know.
Okay,
I'm comfortable with that.
I think we're okay.
okay. Attachment A to the responses was the summary of Eversource emergency spill response procedures. I had requested this in my initial comments to Eversource as part of the stormwater management permit filing with the Conservation Commission. The information that's presented here, I was wondering, does this get given to subcontractors or contractors?
Yes, yes, the answer is yes. That would be part of the request for proposal package that they would be bidding on.
Okay. Here you mentioned the spill response coordinator. Who is that coordinator and how are they contracted?
Ms. Dos Anjos, would you mind reading the language, just to
Sure.
put it in context?
After the spill response coordinator has made an initial assessment, response actions would be carried out in phases or degrees as follows.
What page are we on?
Attachment A,
Attachment A.
Attachment A, page 1.
second paragraph.
In your booklet, I think, if you remember.
So that would be one of two people. It would either be an internal Eversource employee that's an employee of our environmental field response group. They're a group of environmental specialists that deal with assessing any type of release or spills. Most of them are licensed site professionals, which are scientists that have a certification in dealing with any type of contamination or chemical issue or fuel spills. It would be either them, or it would be a combination of them and an outside contractor such as TRC's licensed site professional. And they would be in charge of doing any type of, if necessary, any type of coordination, cleanup, or notification to agencies. And again, that's only if there is a release of that nature, which we expect there will not be.
Sure. One of the things that I think you might want to consider amending here is that on page 2 of the attachment A, you go over regulatory agency coordination and that Eversource would be responsible for reaching out to federal, state, and local authorities if a spill were to happen. My suggestion here is to include department names, functions, and phone numbers here.
Okay. Yep, we can specify that specific to this project. This is intended to be more of an umbrella document, but that's something we can do easily. We can add in any, if you want us to add in the phone number for the Board of Health, Ashland Board of Health, Hopkinton Board of Health, we can add in whichever local authorities need to be notified.
I think it should be all federal,
State and
state,
federal.
local,
Yep.
everything that's triggered, just so it's all on one page.
Sure, yeah, the state would be Mass DEP, and the
As soon
federal
as-
would be EPA.
And you should have the language as soon as it's identified.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Matt, does this become part of the SWIP as well? Or I know that some of the SWIP would typically cover pretty similar information.
Yes, actually, a lot of this language was taken from guidance documents like the CGP. It can be part of the SWIP. As you mentioned, there's a lot of overlapping language as part of just general boilerplate language of the SWIP anyway. But for projects that don't have a SWIP, we would utilize this document on. So if the commission wants to see this incorporated into the SWIP, that's not a problem. It's an easy thing for us to do.
Your stream stats attachment is in attachment G. just for those that are present here in the audience, Stream Stats is a tool that's used through USGS. It's an application that you go online. We use it to understand the size of a watershed that's attributed to a particular water body or stream. Matt Verrill's comments to Eversource was that they include those Stream Stats figures. We're looking at specific numbers and calculations to determine the size of a stream and to see if that's what's called perennial or intermittent. I'm not sure if you've actually included every single stream in the Stream Stats reports. Can you just verify that?
I'm gonna defer to Mr. Paquette.
Actually, I might be able to address that because I was looking at that this afternoon. And I think all the streams that are shown on the plans are included, but I did note that there's at least one, I guess what I would call typographical error where basically there's two stream stats that are included for, it's the same stream stats, but it's called out for two different streams. And I went through and back-checked basically the data, and there were a couple of, I didn't find anything that would change the designation of intermittent or perennial, but I think there's maybe a little bit of housekeeping to be done on those.
Okay. And so that's all set then?
Yeah, I think with a little bit of housekeeping, just for the record, I think it's fine.
Okay. And then my last comment, I promise. One of the things that I would like to do, just so you're aware, between now and whenever this hearing is continued to, is to take a look at those stormwater best management practices that were mapped on your plans. I want to overlay them with our existing layers, because I really want to see where the outfalls affiliated with those BMPs are. And I want to make sure that those outfalls aren't directly connected to the wetland resource areas that you'll be crossing. I'll be doing that between now and the next meeting, just so you know.
Okay.
Okay?
I believe I understand what you're saying. Can I just just to make sure I understand, you'd be
Yeah.
taking our stormwater management features that we've shown on the plan and overlaying them with your own local GIS information and see whether or not the culverts or any stormwater structures are connected into wetlands. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
No further comments?
No more? Okay. Okay, so we're gonna open it to the public, but I want you to do several things for me. It needs to be restricted to wetlands or stormwater management. If it is not, I will try to curtail it. We need to be brief and succinct, as there's a lot of you guys here that may wanna talk, okay? Name, address, please.
Mark Tassoni, 49 Hawthorne Road, brief and distinct and to the point.
Correct. Thank you.
From what we just went through here, sitting here, it was brief. Okay. I have hopefully 3 questions I can have answered here tonight. Is there any sort of bylaw in this town that oversees wetland conservation agenda things that you talked about tonight? Is there bylaws in this town that talks about them?
Yes, there is.
And what are they?
You probably would be better able to say it,
Yes.
Megan.
There are 2 different bylaws that the Conservation Commission here is in charge of. One is the Wetlands Protection Bylaw and its affiliated regulations. The other is the Stormwater Management Regulations, which is a subsequent permit that Eversource has submitted to us and filed with us.
Okay. And has Eversource, if you know this part, entered a right-of-way contract through the town yet?
I don't believe I can answer that. That might be better for Eversource.
Yeah, I
To
don't
answer.
think it goes even under us at all.
We
It's not
wouldn't
part of the
touch that,
wetland. We
no.
wouldn't touch that, Mark. You have another question?
Or can Eversource answer that?
It's not really under our purview. Keep going, please.
Talked about wetlands and digging.
Stormwater
trench-
management.
Stormwater and all that,
Mm-hmm.
but near the middle of all of this is gonna be going through property
And that's not under our purview.
And that's why you didn't talk about it.
Correct, that is the case.
Okay,
Okay?
not done. So I have to formulate. Scenic roads, anything?
That's planning board, and they are
That's planning
in
board.
front of them on September 12th, if you want to go there.
I've been there, I've done, as Ms. Megan kind of knows, I kind of been doing a lot of homework here. and
Okay,
I've been biting my tongue since sitting here tonight. Not
Do you
to-
have any more questions?
Yes, I do. Why does it take, we're talking about wetlands and the subject matter is the last 2 conservation meetings. Why did it take over 2 hours to get all this out every time?
Because there's a lot of work that we're trying to go through to make sure that they are going to do it correctly in terms of the Wetlands Protection Act and stormwater management. It takes a lot of time
And
to go through it all.
would it help that if there could be some handouts that people who get sitting in the seats for 2 hours have something to read to follow?
They're online and they're
If
in
people
the
don't have,
library.
if people don't have copy machines, Xerox things and stuff like that, how else could they get them?
From the library.
And if they don't have transportation to get there, how can they get them?
I can't help you.
They
I
call
don't-
me.
No, they can call her, Megan, and get it.
Okay, and, I don't think this has anything to do with, this project, but I do have a curious question. Like, I watched the last Hopkinton Select Board meeting and the Board of Health representative came up. Does Eversource connect up by their Eversource tanks on Wilson Road? Are they connected up there to come here to go with the project?
I don't know.
I want that
Are they?
answer, I want that answer because I heard
know.
at that meeting that those tanks had a little bit of a,
But those not in our
I know, but,
jurisdiction again.
but if it could, if it happens in a tank, it could happen in a pipe crack.
It's not, okay,
You gotta listen to everything.
thank you, Mark. Anyone else? Okay.
Hi,
Hi, name, address, please?
Nancy Moscato, 73 Brayburn Lane. I've been spending a lot of time at meetings since, probably this spring on this particular subject. And I just want to thank the members of the Conservation Commission for your time, your diligence, your due diligence, and the breadth and depth of your questions. I also want to acknowledge Eversource and the expertise, that you have brought and the time that you have brought to this subject, and your patience. But I just want to say, for the record, and others may feel the same, and I would encourage them to come up here as well, I just want to say I do not feel that the Conservation Commission should approve this project. I do not feel that Eversource should be in our wetlands, period. And I would encourage anybody else that feels the same way, here's your opportunity to get up and tell the Conservation Commission what you think, if that's appropriate. Thank you.
Name and address, please.
Deborah Griffin, 44 Roberts Road. Hi. I'm concerned about a few things. I don't know if you're planning on working on any kind of hills or slopes, but I can imagine over by the dam, it's very slopey there.
I think
And
they can.
what's the plan is for that platform
Do you
and
want
all of this
to address
thing?
the hill things that you guys are doing?
Should I ask all my question first and then
Sure.
take?
Yeah.
Another question I have is you're talking about doing 40-foot sections at a time and possibly soupy stuff in a trough. And so you said you weigh down the pipe and then you weld the ends above water, because I can imagine the water seeps in around your pipe when it's weighted down. How do you weld the ends above the water? So that's very confusing to me. Is it doing some weird thing? Do you have a whole bunch of sections up above the ground at an angle while you're welding it? And then how do you have all of that stuff in troughs? the watery soup. So anyway, that's confusing to me. And then also just my own opinion that it would be really wonderful if we could do renewable energy instead of doing this to the environment. Thank you.
Matt, do you guys wanna answer that, Eversource?
Yes, we're just going through who's gonna answer.
Okay, good.
Well, they're discussing it, hopefully I can answer the welding question for you. So the pipe has some elasticity to it, if it will, even though it's steel, it may seem counterintuitive, but it does have some elasticity to it. So the pipe can be brought up onto the mat, if you will, with the work surface. The rest of it could be in the trench under the water or the dirt or mucky surface, as we mentioned earlier. The section would be welded and it's essentially then dropped into the trench, and then that portion would sink, if you will.
Matt, Sean,
Yep.
could you, I'm sorry, could you comment on her first part about the slope?
Well, he was
Yep,
gonna,
the
the other
tracks
guy
on
was,
the slope.
the other
Okay.
Yeah,
people
he's
were
gonna-
gonna, that's why they were discussing who was gonna talk.
Yeah. So, obviously for steep slope areas, special attention needs to be paid to that, when you're opening up, the ground there. During construction, so there's two levels of attention to give it. One is the construction measures, to make sure that, soil's not moving while you've got the ground disturbed during storm events, things like that. So setting up, for example, temporary diversion water bars to slow any velocity of water that might be moving down the slope during a rainstorm is one measure that can be implemented during construction, to basically, again, keep stormwater from causing impacts in the right-of-way and then off the right-of-way. And then once you've got the pipe in the ground, it's very important to get it restored properly. And there's a number of not post-construction, but restoration measures that can be used in addition to just your standard seeding and mulching. Erosion control blankets can be placed along there, along with hydro seeding. There's other methods like that can be set up. And then trench plugs can be placed inside the trench to act as a barrier to water moving within the trench down gradient. So you don't want to create a conduit that wasn't there before with these trench plugs as well. So there's a number of, I'm sorry, did you want to jump in? Okay.
So I'm more concerned about and wondering about what are you doing with your equipment? You're on a hill. I mean, that's a really, really, really steep hill over at the dam. Are you at the bottom of the hill? Are you working on the hill? And if you're on the hill, you have your mats on one side here and the mats on the other side, and your trough in the middle. Your equipment is going to fall down the hill.
Yeah,
So-
I can clarify that. So if you're concerned about the dam area, we're not actually on the dam itself. So we are north of that in the wetland that lies north of the dam. So if you know where Metropolitan Avenue runs there, the pipeline crosses Metropolitan right near the end of it where it ends at Ashland State Park, and then passes through that wetland, which is well north of where the dam is. So it's super flat in that particular area. That being said, we do have other areas where there are steeper slopes that we need to construct on. And the contractor, and Ken can speak to this, they have specific methods that they can use to make sure, number one, that their equipment's not set at some type of angle that is going to cause an issue with, overtopping and stuff. So I don't think we have any situations like that with the project.
The slope leading into that wetland and leading out of that wetland are almost equally as steep as the dam, though, going up to Chestnut Street and coming into Metropolitan Avenue.
Yeah, I agree that going up after you get out of the wetland, you start going up the hill, you're right, it is relatively steep there.
I think for those steep slopes, we can add conditions into the order of conditions to meet the stormwater management regulations under a bylaw that those slopes be protected during construction.
Name and address, please.
Hi, Kathy Rooney, 36 Fountain Street. So I wanted to start by saying thanks once again to the Conservation Commission for all your thoughtful questions and the enormous amount of time you've had to put into this. I'm another one of those people who hopes you don't approve this, because I can't figure out why in, this century we're doing work like this in the wetlands. It might have been okay for the middle of the last century, but it's not okay now. And I'd also like to see green energy solutions as opposed to more gas in a pipeline. I hope you get as many of these details nailed down in writing from them ahead of time. I also hope that we have at least a couple of our site representatives that they're paying for on site anytime they're doing anything anywhere in this town, because if we're not there to keep an eye on it, then who knows what's happening. We've had plenty of examples of projects around town where we haven't had a site rep there and things went wrong that we didn't want to have go wrong. I'm really concerned about the slops and the spoils, where all that stuff is going to go. It just seems like there's still not enough room. I'm also really concerned that the good soils get back into that trench, that none of those leave our town, and that then when they go to redo any of the planting and seeding they have to do, they're using native plants, native seed mixes, none of the contractor mix junk. They have to do good quality stuff, because these are good quality wetlands that are going to get destroyed by this project. And then last but not least, I know there was an issue in Hopkinton with a local gas company, and they kind of forgot to notify the local fire chief when they had a spill or a problem or something off-gassed. And we got to make sure that all of our local people get informed right away so that they can start mobilizing and taking the proper responses to anything that goes wrong out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Are we continuing this one now? Still we continuing, guys, or what else have you got?
So, Ms. Dos Santos, did you want to mention the technical review meeting that we had planned between Mr. Verrill, yourself, and our team?
Tomorrow afternoon, Matt Verrill and I, as well as Matt Waldrop and his team, are going to be meeting to go over these comments in greater detail, because there's over probably 50 comments generated between the Conservation Commission's peer reviewer and also Eversource's responses. We want to make sure that we can consolidate that and spend time here at Town Hall to review that information in depth, rather than wasting everybody's time here that's been coming and staying here so late. So you want to try to get some of those comments off the book that have been closed. I think a few of them have, but there's still more questions that I have and more questions that Mr. Verrill has that we need to address, and the best way that we think to do that is to meet in a meeting with Eversource, their consultant, and ours as well.
And then you're gonna be reporting those comments back to us.
Correct.
They'll also put answers for whatever questions that we had.
Correct.
And corrections, whatever we suggested they would do.
From the minutes, yeah. Good. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with the comments, thanking you for your efforts. I live in Ashland.
Name and address, sir.
28, Jerry Schaufeld, 28 Brayburn Lane.
Thanks.
And I am appalled at what I'm hearing tonight. We rely on you to protect us against a company that can give answers as loose as we heard tonight. Well, it's best practices. Oh, we've done this on other jobs. I need to know that somebody, if it's your meetings offline, is driving this down to the detail that keeps them accountable. I don't want the pipeline, and I don't even understand why we're doing it. There's never been articulated a benefit to the town of Ashland to do this, but we keep moving along. But I want to challenge that if you're going to have this discussion with them, that you hold them accountable. that it be drawn down to specific specifications, procedures, and however you choose to monitor and keep that going. I need you to know that you're doing that. So thank you for your work. I do not want to see this pipeline in our, now, I do not understand why, but if you're going to go forward, please drive it down to the detail. They got off so easily tonight. They were just hand-waving the answers. We as a town have a right to get better answers than that.
Thank you. All right, so are we continuing this then to, after that? So, go ahead.
Let me grab the book.
Hmm?
I gotta grab the agenda book to see what's going on for the next meeting.
Okay, good. Hold that thought. Okay. Yep, what date are we looking at?
So the next meeting dates are September 9th, September 23rd, October 7th, and October 28th. That being said, I'm away on vacation from September 10th to the 20th, so I don't think I'd have enough time to review anything by come the 24th. The 9th, we have a couple of hearings that are scheduled.
Yeah, that's got Mass DOT too,
Yeah.
that one.
So probably depending upon Eversource's
What do you-
preference.
What do you guys wanna,
I think our preference would be to continue to the 23rd of September.
is that, what do you think?
I can tell you right now, I won't have time to review anything or any revisions between now and then because I'm going away between September 10th and the 20th.
Okay.
Right, now if you meet now though, would you have time before that, the 9th, the 10th to review them, do you think?
I'm trying.
Do you think? or-
My hope is to try to get them something by the end of this week.
So we can always request a continuance later, right?
Yeah.
If it looks
Yeah.
like we are not.
If
I
she's
mean, I
not
would-
ready, at
yeah.
that point, we might have to move
I
it
just-
out.
I
You'd
wouldn't
rather
want to
do it then?
continue until October and then find out that we do have everything prepared by the 23rd.
Okay.
So
Okay,
I think
but
that would be our
Just
preference.
be prepared that if she doesn't have it already by then, we might have to move forward.
Understood.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so we're gonna set the next meeting continued to do we need a motion for that?
Yeah.
Okay, somebody wanna make a
I
motion?
move that this be continued to 23rd September.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you
folks.
for your time.
This is it for this one. We're
Thank
moving
you.
on to other stuff. Thank you.
We appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much.
Don't forget your slip there, Matt. You have a slip there.
You want to wait until they all leave?
Yeah.
Oh, just have a minute with Cliff.
Matt, don't forget your slip right there.
we're gonna continue our meeting. Oh, so sorry. That's okay.
All right.
Bye. All right, request for COC, is that the things that we've gotta do now?
I don't recommend for this first one, the
Okay.
COC 95871, that we act on this one. The only
And
reason
why?
being is because in between 224 Olive Street and 204 Olive Street, where the wetlands kind of meet the bottom of the toe of the slopes there's a dip where the sewer line went in. And I don't know if it's a result of the sewer line work or if it's always been there, because it is typically where you'd see a dip in a roadway. I've asked DPW to comment, and I haven't heard back from them yet. I just want to make sure that I can get them to fix something if it was their fault.
Where's that dip? Is it near Spring Street?
224 and 204.
Yeah, but I don't know where they are.
So 204 Spring Street is right next to, 204 Olive Street is right next to Spring Street, where it connects or
Okay,
intersects with
and
Olive
then
Street.
going towards Simpsons from there?
You got it. And it's right at that dip right before you come back
Yeah,
up
I
over
know
that hill.
exactly what you're talking about, yeah.
If you guys can take a look at that too, I would appreciate it. I know Jean can't, and I know, I'm gonna ask Bill to do it too. Okay?
Yeah.
So the you're waiting really for the DPW to get back to
So
you
what,
on it.
what are you expecting there, Meg? What are the conditions that are,
We're not gonna do anything, is what she's saying.
I'll respond back to Dan tomorrow and let him know that I'm just
well,
waiting.
we're not gonna do anything, but what are we looking to see if is complete or not?
So at this point, we've received all the documentation that we need. It's just a matter of making sure that we verify with the as-built plans and the on-site conditions. My main concern is looking at that dip. The reason being is because it's right above a wetland system. I want to make sure, A, it's not getting lower, B, that there's no sediment coming out from underneath it. Because there's no culvert that's there, so it makes no sense that there's a dip there.
And DPW are they gonna look at that too?
I've asked DPW to look at it. I have yet to hear back.
Okay.
That was
It's
like a
on
week ago.
hold until you get that information back, right?
Correct.
Okay, the next one, COC 95-879.
7 Walcott Road is all set. I think he can get the certificate of compliance. I recommend a complete.
Okay, motion, guys?
Okay, a motion to grant the COC for 95-879.
Second?
Seconded?
KG second.
Yeah, we need a favor.
I second.
Aye.
I did.
Yeah,
All
we need
in
a
favor.
vote.
All in-
Huh?
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Sorry.
It's late.
It is.
4-0.
I'm exhausted.
Hey, I got
Yeah.
the motion part. What do you want?
90,
Without you making the motions, we're lost.
I know. Okay, request for extension 95-844, what's that?
95-844 is that last law on Harrington Drive that abuts the Ashland Town Forest. You guys
Yep.
may recall this one. The permit was issued back in 2013.
Yep.
They've gotten an extension that was dated October 18th, 2016. No site work has begun there, just the clearing of the land. The property still remains for sale. DEP, as you know, also has a stake in this because they have a superseding order of conditions for this property. DEP, I spoke to Pam Merrill, and she's gonna check with her circuit, with her chief to see what their decision is going to be. So I recommend that we wait for their decision and kind of piggyback off of DEP.
Okay,
So we'll push this off
Okay.
to the next meeting, I think.
okay, so you're gonna let them
We
know
we
that?
have that email in our packet from DEP that we
Oh,
got tonight.
okay, I didn't see
Yep.
that, okay.
I'm also waiting for proof that the extension permit from the last time was recorded. There is no bylaw or regulation that talks about recording an extension within X amount of days of it being issued. It only really talks about an extension being recorded before construction begins, just so you know. 0 McGunko Road is the next one. You guys
Yep.
ready?
What
Yeah.
is that? That's not on mine.
Yep, it's number 4 under other business.
It says Orlando Enterprises.
Oh, yeah, got
request.
it, okay.
Got it?
Yeah.
Okay, so similar, they haven't gotten an extension in the past. However, they haven't started work, and right now it's being used as a staging area. They're thinking that construction may begin in 2020, but nothing concrete. One of the reasons to one of the reasons that the regulations go into denying a request for an extension is because work hasn't started or the wetland lines have changed and a new filing is needed. But these guys have not gotten an extension before. This is their first one. I leave it up to the commission to decide if you want to extend this one. And his extension letter didn't say for a period of 1 or 3 years. But I leave it to you to decide.
I can't remember if I voted on this. I remember being a part of this discussion because I didn't agree with the determination of whether Trolley Brook was intermittent or, you know, we've been down this road before with other things.
You did vote on it.
What's it was referred to as a ditch in the original deliberations. And we said, wait a minute, what ditch? And it turned out that it was Trolley Brook, which was then determined to, I think this was voted on when I wasn't at the meeting, because
That's right.
I don't think I would have.
You were not here, correct?
Okay.
Wow, memory.
So it's hard for
Yeah.
me to vote on this one again, because I didn't vote on it the first time, and I wouldn't have supported it the first time.
So does that mean?
We can't vote because we don't have a,
Well, we can't vote tonight.
right.
Would 3-1 still pass, though? Is the quorum out of this number of seats, or is it out of the number of bodies present? Anybody know?
I think we can.
I would rather have the other two
Jean
members
and
here
Bill.
for
Yeah.
this.
Sure.
Push that one off
Yeah,
then.
how far back are we going with this one?
Yeah,
Just 3 years ago.
I think Jeffrey Lingham was there at the time.
It's right at the end of, between the railroad tracks and Magunko Road.
I think, yeah, wait
That-
until
that
the other
parking
two are
area
here to
right
do
there.
it. Because we could do it with the Mass
Magunko
You know where the
DOT,
dance
right?
studio is?
Yeah,
No, he won't
Okay,
be here.
across the street.
Gene won't
All
be
right.
here when Mass DOT is here.
Nope.
And he's out when Mass DOT.
Oh, and one more thing to note on Magunko Road, their order of conditions expired in June. However, that's not their fault. They submitted a request back in January. I thought we had acted on it, and I went back in the file and I saw no paper copies of us issuing an extension. I saw nothing in the minutes, so unfortunately, their January paperwork got lost.
Well, if it's waited this long, let's wait until Jean is here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that won't be until
Well,
October.
then wait until somebody's here besides me.
Sure.
Okay, well, Bill will be here at some point.
If they're not gonna
anyway.
build for another year,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any difference if we wait until Jean is here.
Sure.
Okay.
Isn't that what the letter said, that they're not
Spring
planning on
2020,
building?
spring.
Spring
So it's
2020.
already expired, it's just a matter of how long it has expired.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so
No, I
let's
gotcha.
wait till the proper people are here to rule on this one.
Sure. I just wanted to make sure you knew that as well.
We did the
Meeting minutes was did.
Yeah.
Appoint a member of the Conservation Commission to Nyanza. Maybe we should wait for a full board.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. Move that one along.
Updates on ongoing projects, 170.
Let me give you my update on that possibility of being there. I can definitely do that.
You can do that?
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, let's just.
On the
Nyanza?
Nyanza, but you can vote on next time.
Well, then
No,
let's
let's
let's vote on it. Quick.
Make a motion, quick,
Okay.
before he gets away.
I make a motion to appoint KG to the Nyanza Advisory Committee representing the Conservation Commission.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Including me, yes, 4.
Thank you.
I didn't recuse myself for voting for myself.
You can vote for yourself.
Of course.
Good, we got that done too.
President
Okay,
votes for himself for his
updates on
election.
ongoing projects.
So the only update that I have here, that's listed anyways, is
Can't vote if you
175
don't.
Butterfield Drive. 175 Butterfield Drive is coming to a close, and they just wanted to know if the commission wanted to do a site inspection out there. The reason why I recommended it was because this is one of the few requests for COCs that have come in since I've been your agent here, where replication areas were involved. So I wasn't sure if the commission typically would walk sites like this, or if you just leave it to kind of the wetland scientist and myself.
Well,
Okay.
I have a question. Is it now Butterfield Drive, or is it still Butterfield Drive?
That's a cool name.
Butter filing.
I think we can leave it to her and the wetland scientist
To determine
check
the
the, yeah,
field of food.
to check the
Fine.
replication areas.
Sure. I'm fine with that.
Me
Fine.
too, yeah,
Okay.
Okay.
all set.
So the only signed document we've got is Mr. Harrison at 7 Walcott, correct?
Yep.
Okay, it's
And
passing
when
around
we
right now.
okayed.
Other than that, the only other thing is that I'm going on vacation. I'm going away from September 10th to the 20th, and I'll be back in the office on the 23rd.
Enjoy your vacation.
Thank you.
Yeah, just stress out before. You let us know if there's a problem with getting it, you know, this stuff together for them.
It might be, but
If it is,
I'll figure it out.
If it is, then we let them know so that they know they need to then continue it.
Yep.
That's all. They understood that. We were
Thank you.
clear about that with them,
Yep, we were.
so it's not like they are going to be surprised.
Is that it, Meg?
That's it.
Okay, motion
Motion to
to
adjourn.
adjourn?
I said it. You got a
Second, somebody?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.